The air does not move. The silence before damnation is never truly silence, for there are whispers beneath it. The soil is cracked and thirsty, yet it drinks not water but the seepage of things that do not belong in this universe. A world awaiting damnation feels the weight of eyes it cannot see, eyes that peer from rifts between reality and nightmare. To stand upon such a world is to feel every heartbeat counted by forces that delight in the tally, as if the pulse itself were already theirs. The corruption begins unnoticed. Shadows lengthen where no sun moves. A child's laughter curdles into a scream that no one else can hear. Iron rusts though no rain falls. By the time the first shrine burns, and the first vox grill emits only the howling of unseen throats, it is already too late. The demonic tide has chosen its ground, and the world is little more than a feast table awaiting the knives. The world still seemed whole, in the way a corpse still seems like a man for a few hours after the breath has left it. The people went about their labors, sweat beading down their brows in manufactoria lit by the constant fire of furnaces. Hive markets clattered with barter, the clang of boots and steel drowning out the unease that hovered at the edge of perception. To most, life remained an endless cycle of work, devotion, and exhaustion. Yet if one listened closely, beneath the machine hum and the drone of the sermons, something else was present. A vibration of unease, the pulse of a predator that had already sunk its claws into the world's marrow. It never begins with horns or fire or the thunderous tread of demons. No, corruption is sly. It begins with small betrayals of reality itself, so quiet that the Adeptus Administratum files them as anomalies, mishaps, or superstition. A voxcaster tuned to the proper frequency might suddenly release not a command sequence, but a child sobbing, endless and hollow, until the speaker's wires melted into slag. A water cistern in a hab block ran black for 3 days before inexplicably clearing, and those who drank from it found themselves murmuring words of praise to gods they could not name. And when the Schola Progenium instructor beat the madness out of one child, the boy's blood burned with a color that no one had words for. The planetary governor received these reports in the secure data slates brought by his adepts, his brows knitting with irritation more than fear. An efficient ruler knows not to waste attention on every superstition muttered by underhivers. The administratum breeds suspicion, but the Imperium demands indifference. Too many worlds fall if one entertains every ghost story, every phantom cult. And yet, his hand hovered over the Inquisition cipher more than once, his thumb grazing the rune that would send a cry for aid. He never pressed it. To invite the Inquisition is to admit weakness, and weakness is to invite execution. So he told himself that order remained, that faith was strong, that the tithes would be met. He told himself these things because the alternative was unthinkable. The Arbites heard it differently. They knew the shift in the air, the way riots start not with flames but with murmurs. Patrols down in the mid-hive quarters found themselves surrounded by faces too still, eyes unblinking as if awaiting a signal from somewhere else. Their shock mauls cracked bone as they always had, but the people they struck bled with strange serenity, as though pain had been forgotten. One RBT sergeant reported that a crowd did not disperse even after fire was opened. They simply walked into the rounds, their bodies piling, their mouths moving in silent unison, as though chanting to some hidden rhythm. The report was dismissed as an exaggeration. The sergeant was reassigned to a penal battalion on a distant front, and yet all of this was still survivable, still deniable, still at the level of whispers and bureaucratic dismissal. The manufacturer continued their output, their smokestacks marking the horizon like the spines of great beasts. The prayers to the emperor still filled the air, led by priests who thundered about the wages of heresy. But the sermons grew harsher, the litanies more desperate. "The enemy is within you," the confessor bellowed from the pulpit, sweat running down his face. "The weakness of flesh is the crack through which the foe seeps. Cut it out or the foe will find you," the congregation roared in reply. But some roared not with conviction, but to drown the hollow laughter they swore they heard echoing in their skulls. There was a child who saw too much. She lived near the underhive sump fields, where the air was always damp and stank of promethium runoff. Her family thought her sickly, for she never slept well and always stared at corners no one else noticed. One night, she told her mother that the shadows whispered to her, that they promised her sweet things if only she would follow. Her mother wept, beat her, dragged her to the nearest chapel, and begged the priest to save her daughter's soul. The priest recited the litanies, pressed an aquila against her skin and told her to stand firm in faith. But the girl only laughed, her voice deeper than it should have been, and said that faith tastes like ash. The priest reported nothing. He burned the child alive before the altar and told the mother her daughter had died of plague. No record entered the archives. This is the first mercy of chaos, the mercy of being ignored. For no world falls in a day. No demon bursts forth without first preparing the stage. It is in the silences, the quiet corners, the whispers no one dares to repeat aloud. It is in the denial of governors, the fear of priests, the weariness of common men who see too much but say too little. In this denial, chaos grows. In this silence, the seed takes root. And though the world still spins and the factories still roar and the tithes are still counted, the planet is already dying. The air itself seemed thicker now, though no one spoke of it. The soldier stationed near the defense bastions remarked that his lasgun felt heavier in his arms. He thought it weariness, until he saw that the aquila engraved upon its stock was subtly altered, not carved by hand, twisted, as though the metal itself had been persuaded to grow differently. No one believed him. When he filed the report, he was executed for blasphemy. His body was left in the sump for scavengers. It is always this way. The first cracks in reality are visible only to those who cannot convince others. Madness, paranoia, superstition, these are the words applied, and by the time they are abandoned, it is already too late. For when reality itself begins to bend, it never bends back. The great hive towers of the capital still blazed with light, their spires stabbing into a smog-thick sky. From a distance they seemed immutable, an iron fortress against both famine and fear. Yet inside those endless chambers and stacked dwellings, something corrosive seeped through the cracks in daily life. Workers at the assembly lines began humming in rhythm with their machines, but the tune was not one any overseer recognized. It was too precise, too resonant, as if guided by some unseen choir. Overseers tried to silence them with whips and shock prods, but the hum returned, growing stronger each day, until even the enforcers felt their hearts beating in cadence with the unholy rhythm. The Mechanicus adepts noticed it first in the machines. The logic engines spat out calculations that contradicted themselves, recursive loops forming in what should have been perfect data. Cogitators clicked and whirred with new voices, whispering sequences in tongues no binaric translation could resolve. One Magos declared that the machine spirits were becoming aware. His peers denounced him, yet more than one found themselves privately unsettled when servitors froze mid-task, their eyes staring not with programmed emptiness, but with something resembling recognition. Recognition not for their masters, but for some other presence, a master they would not name. Still life carried on. Ships docked, grain shipments unloaded, taxes collected. Humanity's great strength in the Imperium is its capacity to endure. That endurance, however, is also its blind spot, for endurance easily becomes denial. The priests thundered louder, demanding ever more offerings, ever harsher penances. Whips cracked across the backs of sinners dragged into the square. Children were flogged for speaking in their sleep. Men and women were executed for looking too long at the wrong shadows. The populace applauded, thinking the cleansing fire would keep them safe. But each drop of blood spilled seemed to feed something unseen. Each prayer chanted in fear seemed to echo back not toward terror, but deeper into the ground beneath their feet. One Arbit's officer, patrolling the lower levels of the hive, claimed that he saw faces in the walls. Not paintings, not carvings, but faces pressing outward through the stone itself, mouths open in silent screams. His report was scrubbed. He was declared unfit, his service record sealed. The next man to patrol that same corridor refused to enter, claiming he heard his dead mother calling his name from the shadows. He was beaten until his teeth broke, then forced inside. The next day he was gone. No trace, no struggle. Only his shock maul lying in the dust, still humming faintly, as though it had struck something not of this world. In the upper hive, where nobles reclined in perfumed chambers, the signs were subtler but no less damning. A feast was held in the governor's honor, silver goblets filled with vintage wines. Yet those who drank swore the liquid was sweeter than wine, thick upon the tongue, intoxicating. No one dared question it aloud, for it was easier to laugh and say the vintner had done well than to acknowledge the aftertaste of copper that lingered on their lips. When one noble collapsed mid-toast, his body convulsing as his veins blackened beneath his skin. The attendants dragged him away quickly. By the next day, his name was erased from all records, his holdings redistributed. The revel continued. Some few still whispered the truth. A preacher of the lower districts, gaunt and half-mad, took to the streets declaring that the Emperor's light no longer reached the Hive. He screamed that the Astronomicon had gone dim, that the very air trembled with the laughter of demons. People spat at him, hurled stones, called him a liar. And yet at night, when they lay awake staring into the darkness above their beds, they wondered if perhaps his ravings contained a seed of truth. But no one spoke of it in daylight. No one dared. Meanwhile, in the manufactoria, accidents multiplied. Conveyor belts ran themselves without workers. A furnace flared blue for 3 hours, its fire forming shapes that should not exist, shapes that twisted the stomach of anyone who watched too long. A machine broke down, gears shrieking as if alive, and when it stopped, the walls around it were coated in frost, though the temperature had never dropped. The workers prayed harder, worked harder, hoping their labor itself would protect them. But labor cannot protect against the warp. The warp thrives on desperation. The governor finally convened his council, summoning the Mechanicus Magi, the Arbeitscommanders, the ecclesiarchy priests. Each presented their reports. Each argued the other was to blame. The Magi insisted the flesh was weak, that humans had corrupted the machines. The priests screamed of heresy and lack of faith. The Arbeits spoke of riots and disorder, blaming the common people. And through it all, the governor nodded, listened, and did nothing. His pride outweighed his fear. To act decisively would be to admit the world was not in control, and that was something he would not concede. He looked upon the Aquila behind his throne and whispered to himself that the Emperor protects. But even as he spoke the words, the golden icon seemed to shimmer, one wing subtly drooping as if rotting before his eyes. He blinked and it was whole again. He said nothing. This is how it always begins, not with thunder but with silence, not with fire but with whispers. The world still functions, still bleeds, still prays. But in every prayer there is a seed of fear. In every face there is an echo of hunger. The first cracks in reality are spreading, hairline fractures across the skin of the world. And beneath that skin, something is waiting to push through. By now the unease had begun to bleed into the dreams of the populace. Men and women who had never spoken to each other awoke with the same visions. Skies torn open like wounds, rivers of blood coursing through the hab blocks, and laughter that seemed to drip like molten wax from the stars themselves. They tried to bury these dreams in silence, but when 100 workers confess the same vision to their confessor, even the most rigid priest grows afraid. The sermons that followed no longer thundered with certainty, but quavered with desperation. The priests demanding blood, sacrifice, anything to prove the Emperor's light still lingered here. And so the floggings grew harsher, the executions swifter. Children were burned as witches for speaking the truth of their dreams. Parents were forced to watch as their kin screamed, the flames illuminating their faces until the skin peeled back from their bones. The priests told them this was salvation. Yet when the smoke rose, the air tasted of copper and salt, and those who breathed it in found their thoughts quickened with words that were not their own. The Underhive had become a place of dread. Fires burned there not for warmth but for ritual. Voices echoed through the pipes, impossible voices, layered one atop another like 1,000 throats speaking from a single mouth. Whole hab blocks fell silent, their windows dark, their doors sealed from the inside. When Arbeits broke the seals, they found only blood on the walls and strange symbols carved into the flesh of the inhabitants. None of the enforcers lasted long. Some put their own sidearms beneath their jaws, rather than patrol those corridors again. Others vanished entirely, their armor left behind in neat stacks as though undressed by careful hands. Reports continued to filter upward, but each was stamped with the sigil of denial. To spread panic is heresy, to speak of demons is heresy, and so the silence became the weapon of chaos. The Mechanicus delved deeper into their own mysteries, searching for answers in their machine prayers. But their answers came not from the Omnissiah, but from elsewhere. When they performed diagnostics upon the reactor cores, the engines whispered back to them, at first in the language of Binaric, then in words twisted but unmistakable. The reactor promised them perfection, knowledge, transcendence, if only they would listen. Some tore out their own augmetics to silence the voices. Others embraced them. Airforge Magos, once known for his meticulous devotion, appeared one day with his robes torn open, his chest marked in scars that formed patterns not of the machine god, but of something older, darker. He was seized and incinerated in a furnace, his screams drowned by the roar of fire. But among the adepts who watched, more than one felt the urge to etch those same patterns into their own flesh. Even the sky seemed to rebel. The world's sun burned with a faint discoloration, a hue that had no name. Vox signals began to distort. Imperial broadcasts that once carried hymns now dissolved into static, punctuated by sighs and low moans. Some ships refused to dock, reporting that their astropaths sensed a foulness coiling around the planet. Others arrived, but their crews spoke of nightmares that did not end with waking, of shapes glimpsed upon the void, larger than cities, pressing against reality as though testing its seams. The governor dismissed them as cowards, yet he slept less each night, his bed soaked with sweat, his ears straining against the silence for sounds he could not name. Among the Astra Militarum garrison, morale began to fracture. Soldiers whispered that their last fire seemed weak, that their weapons no longer obeyed. Some claimed they saw figures moving at the edge of their vision, shapes with too many limbs or none at all. When one regiment refused to take up arms, their commissar executed half a platoon on the spot. The rest obeyed, but their eyes were hollow as if their spirits had already been broken. Still, the drills continued, the parades were held. The illusion of strength persisted as it always must, until the final moment breaks it. There were moments of denial, moments of stubbornness. Humanity excels at both. A mother dragging her child to the chapel, forcing the Aquila into his small hands, though he wept. A worker smashing his mirror because the reflection moved after he did. A soldier closing his eyes, muttering the catechism of fury as the voices in the barracks whispered his name. These were small rebellions, but they were not enough. For every prayer uttered, there was an echo deeper and louder, mocking, promising. For every lash that tore flesh in the name of purity, there was another wound opening unseen, bleeding into the warp. The world had not yet fallen, but it leaned. Like a structure with too many cracks in its foundation, it listed toward collapse. All it awaited was a push. That push would not come from within, but from beyond. Already the veil between reality and the immaterium was thinning, threads stretched taut and trembling. No one could see it with their eyes, but all could feel it in their bones. Every breath tasted wrong, every shadow lingered too long, every silence pressed too heavy. And when such things persist, when they saturate the air and the blood, they become inevitability. The first cracks had widened, and what pushes through those cracks is never gentle. It began not with fire, but with sound. A sound so low it was almost imperceptible at first, like the deep hum of a reactor far below the hive's foundation. It was constant, pulsing, a vibration felt more in the bones than the ears. At first, people dismissed it as faulty engines or the endless thrum of machinery, but the sound did not fade. It grew. It followed them into their beds, seeped into their prayers, resonated in their teeth until even silence felt loud. Soon workers found themselves humming it unconsciously. Children tapped their feet in rhythm with it. Whole congregations began to shift their voices during sermons, turning hymns into something slightly altered, just enough to make the priests falter mid-verse. And the hum beneath it all did not stop. It rose. It demanded. When the first rift opened, it was small. No grand wound in the sky, no colossal gateway spilling horrors across the horizon. It was a slit of nothing in the air above a sump pit, barely wider than a man's hand. The guards who saw it thought their eyes deceived them. But when they looked again, the slit was still there, and something within it stared back. They swore they saw colors that were not colors, shapes that did not exist, and then they heard laughter. Not loud, not obvious. A whisper, curling through their minds like smoke. One guard shot himself through the skull. The other fell to his knees and began to pray, but not to the emperor. News of the anomaly never reached the governor. The Arbites burned the bodies, sealed the pit, silenced the witnesses. Denial held the line for one more day, then another, but the fractures had spread too far. In the manufactoria, machines began to disobey. Pistons pounded in rhythms that matched the hum. Conveyor lines twisted their belts into grotesque knots. Servitors stopped mid-task, mouths opening in silent screams as blood streamed from their augmetic eyes. Adepts scoured the data streams for solutions, but the equations had turned into scripture. A scripture not written by human hands. The ecclesiarchy doubled their efforts, preaching louder, sacrificing more, demanding complete obedience. But their voices cracked beneath the weight of what they could not admit aloud, that their God's light had grown faint here. They prayed until their throats bled. They set fire to hundreds in the plazas, chanting that the Emperor protects. And yet, when the ashes cooled, symbols remained scorched into the stone, patterns no priest could erase. The faithful stared at them too long, and their eyes glazed over as though remembering something ancient. The governor still insisted the world remained whole. He ordered the Arbites to crush dissent, the Astra Militarum to stand firm, the Mechanicus to repair the manufactoria. But even as he spoke, the lights flickered in his chamber. The Aquila, above his throne, bent in its shadow, its wings curling inward like claws. He rubbed his eyes and told himself it was nothing. Nothing. And yet, outside his palace, reality frayed. In the Underhive, whole districts fell to silence, as if the population had vanished overnight. No screams, no struggle, only emptiness and the faint smell of iron in the air. In the Upper Hive, nobles began to gather in secret, whispering that perhaps new gods had come, gods who offered more than a distant emperor bound to a throne. They told themselves they were pragmatic, that survival demanded adaptation. But when they whispered, their words twisted into cadences they did not recognize. The hum deepened. It rattled the bones of the planet, reverberating through stone and steel alike. And then came the dreams, not just for the poor or the weak, but for all. The governor dreamed of a great beast coiling around his world, its body made of shadow and fire, its eyes vast and endless. The priests dreamed of voices chanting their sermons back to them, twisted, mocking, each word sharpened into blasphemy. The soldiers dreamed of their weapons rusting in their hands, their last fire turning to ash. And in every dream, the laughter returned, echoing, promising. The world does not fall all at once. It leans, it bends, it cracks. But when the cracks run deep enough, when denial can no longer hold them shut, the weight of the warp presses through. Already the veil was thin, trembling with anticipation. The hum was not merely sound, it was invitation. A call answered not by men, but by what waits beyond. And when the veil breaks, no fortress, no creed, no discipline of flesh or steel will matter. What comes through is hunger. What comes through is madness. What comes through is not meant for mortal eyes. The first cracks had become wounds, and the wounds were bleeding. Soon they would tear wide. Soon the manufactoria, the hives, the whole of this world would face the truth it had denied. For the corruption was no longer silent. It was singing. And when the world hears the song of the warp, there is no going back. The first true night of fear fell without changing the color of the sky. The smog still pressed like old cloth against the stars. The hive still bled light from a million windows, and the manufactoria continued to cough smoke and iron breath. But the rhythm of the world, the thud of presses, the clatter of chain hooks, the churn of conveyor lines, slid half a beat off, like a heart startled into arrhythmia. Down on line 37 of sump level Gamma, a line-minder named Ral kept watching his counterchron, expecting the hour sigil that never arrived. He had no talent for augury, no sanction upon his soul, only a lifetime of counting parts and dodging the overseer's lash. Yet the hairs on his forearms lifted at the same instant. The line's warning rune winked out and refused to return. Out beyond the machines, away in the maze of cranes and pipes, something breathed as if the entire hall were a lung, inhaling through 1,000 broken vents and exhaling a mist that smelled of promethium and wet copper. Ral signaled a halt, but the servitors did not heed him. They pushed, they cut, they hammered, and their mouths dribbled thin threads of oil as if the task itself had become hunger. A siren began, not the shriek reserved for fire or hull breach, but a tone the workers had no memory of hearing, a pitch that seemed to go on ascending long after it had climbed past what any horn should reach. A junior engine seer was the first to run, robes hitched high, mechadendrites shivering with static, as he tried to herd the nearest servitor to safety with a litany of command. The words should have been gospel to a machine spirit. They fell from his vox grill and scattered like grain thrown at a storm. The servitor turned its head toward him, teeth bared as if rediscovering what a mouth could do. Raoul reached for the engine seer on instinct and dragged him aside just as the cutter arm scythed down. The blade met the floor. Sparks cascaded. Raoul let go. The engine seer vomited thin black liquid through his grill, coughed once more, and whispered a blessing to the Omnissiah that terminated in a stutter, as though a second voice had spliced itself into his throat. Across the aisle, a squad from the Astra Militarum moved as if mired in syrup, lays guns at the shoulder, muzzles steady, faces pallid, a commissar barking over the hum that had seeped into everything. They were not here for the workers. They were here for order, and the distinction mattered. "Stand to! Lines halt! Hands high!" The sergeant roared, the words pounding the air like nails. Raoul lifted his hands. Others did too. A woman beside him, Lisa, a rigger who could coil chain cable in her sleep, kept staring at a point above the squad's heads, eyes wide and wet. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. But the whisper went everywhere as if carried by the hall itself. Some of the soldiers twitched. One lowered his weapon a finger's breadth, then hoisted it again with a curse and a prayer. The overseer finally arrived, late as always, with a shock prod in one hand and a data slate in the other, its screen a maze of dead sigils. He jabbed the prod into Raoul's ribs. The charge caught and crawled through flesh like a cold animal. Raoul grunted and staggered but did not fall. The overseer raised the prod for a second strike, then froze, not in fear but in literal stillness, as if he'd forgotten what motion was. His pupils dilated until the iris vanished. The prod hissed where it touched the floor, drawing a hairline scorch that curved and curved, until the pattern formed an eye that saw nothing natural. A guardsman swore and fired. The beam snapped the overseer backward, chest smoking. He did not bleed. He cracked like pottery set too long in a kiln and then doused. Someone began to sing, and the singing was wrong. It came from above, from the gantries, from the walkways, from welders who had never known a hymn beyond the catechisms of safe operation. The words were formless, a sound made of yearning and teeth. Raoul did not realize he was crying until the tears tasted of iron. He rubbed them away with the back of his hand and found the skin already marked. No cut, no bruise, but a faint imprint like the bite of a gear that had only kissed him in dream. Lisa clutched his sleeve. "We need to go," she said, as if the thought had only now become aloud. He nodded and tried to reply, but his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth as if the air had thickened into glue. The squad pushed forward, and the commissar's cap brushed the underside of a crane hook that had not been there a moment before. It snagged and ripped. The commissar snatched the cap from the floor with an oath, and when he looked up, his gaze snagged on the crane's long chain. The chain swayed without wind, tapping the hook against the beam in a rhythm that matched the hum that matched the pulse in every body. Tap, tap, tap. The soldiers began to breathe in time. Raoul forced his own lungs to stutter off rhythm, like stepping out of a march, and nausea rolled through him, fierce and nearly sweet. Lisa squeezed his sleeve until her nails bit. The engine seer at their feet tried once more to speak by Narration, and only managed a whine that made the servitors twitch, as if remembering a name. They had sworn never to hear. Someone on the far line pulled an emergency lever. The kill switch should have starved the presses, shut down the cutters, voided the assembly floor of all but emergency light. Instead, every lumen flamed brighter, bleaching color from faces, painting the world in a harsh monochrome that made shadows crisp as blades. Beyond the nearest bulkhead, a door cycled of its own accord. The sigils on its frame, engraved by the Mechanicus to bind and placate, peeled as if the metal were bark and the tree beneath had turned to meat. Through the door came a stink older than any sump, something like spices, something like rot. Something like the inside of a tooth when the nerve is exposed and touched by cold air. A roar sheared through the hall as two Skitari broke from a side passage, their visors cold with green runes, galvanic rifles held with the casual certainty of hands that had been spared all doubt. They moved as if time were obedient to them, each step so exact it mocked the chaos around. Vox clicks rattled from their transceivers, bursts of machine prayer that tried to nail the world back to itself. The nearest servitors jerked as if struck by invisible lashes, half resetting, half swooning. For a moment, the hum faltered. For a heartbeat, Ral could believe this might hold. Then the singing above modulated, and something answered the skitari from the gantries with a chime so pure it hurt. The engine seer flinched, bled anew from the grill. The skitari pivoted together, rifles seeking. The beamlines they fired stitched the upper walkways, turned iron to steam and men to holes. Bodies fell. Some burst like overripe fruit. Others unfolded, joint by joint, like flowers opening, petal by petal, to reveal faces beneath faces and mouths within mouths, each smiling as they struck the floor and rose without bones. The skitari stepped back, not far, just enough to acknowledge that even numbered steps have limits when the floor decides to move under you. The commissar recovered. He threw his voice into the blaze of lumens and fear. "By the throne, form ranks." The sergeant obeyed. So did the squad. Ral did not. Perhaps he lacked the habit. Perhaps he had never been taught to put his body into a line on a day the world tilted. He dragged Lisa. The engine seer scrabbled after them, mechadendrites clinging to the grated floor with a sound like claws. The three of them stitched their way through pillars and belts toward a maintenance hatch that had always been locked by a code no one on their line possessed. It stood open now. Inside, stairs spiraled down into breathless dark. Above, a gantry girder screamed its steel cry, not the panicked shriek of failing metal, but the clean warble of something delighted. The skitari shot until heat shimmered around their barrels. The squad fired until their packs clicked empty. The commissar's voice scraped raw, orders becoming litanies, litanies becoming requests. Requests becoming a single word he had only allowed himself to think in private prayer. Please. The hum answered. It swelled. It merely waited to choose where to step next. Ral, Lisa, and the engine seer took the first spiral, then the second, then the third. The hatch above them sighed shut, kind or cruel, Ral could not say. The stairwell had no lumen strips. Their breath made fog they could taste. The engine seer whispered a phrase to the omnisire, and it arrived back immediate and reversed, as if the stairwell were a throat that swallowed and spoke simultaneously. Lisa reached for Ral's hand in the dark and found it. He had not known the last time he'd touched another human without the shell of work between them. He did not intend to let go. The engine seer's mechadendrites tapped the steps, counting by touch, and somewhere below a sound answered, tapping back, too far to see and too close to ignore. The stairwell turned again. A draft rose, cold, clean, unlike the sump, tasting of stone that has never seen sun and water that remembers glaciers. A maintenance door presented itself out of the black, painted with a stencil that read in flaking letters, Sub-Reclaim 2. The engine seer steadied himself, extended a sparking cable from one dendrite, and brushed the lock plate. For a breath, the plate resisted, as if it remembered the order of things. Then the plate sighed like an old man into sleep, and the door clicked. They went through. The room beyond was not a room but a maze of pipes wide as streets and valves the size of confessionals. Roll had worked the upper lines all his life and had never seen this deep. It smelled of old iron and fresher blood. Somewhere a slow drip measured time. Somewhere else a wheel turned itself one notch and then one notch back. Consent and refusal, courting each other in metal. Lisa crouched beside a junction box and put her ear against its casing. "There are voices," she said. "They're arguing." Ral almost asked which voices, then did not. Some questions are like lifting your eyes to the wrong lumen and blinding yourself for an hour. The engine seer found a panel and fumbled among relays with the instinct of a man feeling for steps in floodwater. He dragged a breath through his vox grill and made his voice steady by force. "There is a grid beneath the grid," he said. "This should not be here." Ral believed him, not because he understood the machine's map, but because the words smelled true. Lisa pointed deeper, to where the pipes bent away into a tunnel with a ceiling too low for comfort. "There," she said. "Down is always safer than up when the sky is wrong." Ral almost laughed. He did not, because the laugh would have been too loud. They moved. The tunnel carried them into a pressure of silence that rested on the shoulders like wet cloth. Past the first bend, a light bloomed soft as the glow from a devotional candle lit at midnight when a hawk-eyed priest is not watching. Ral reached toward it without meaning to, and recoiled when he felt warmth where there should have been only the chill of buried stone. He squinted. The source was a lumen globe, but the filament inside wrote letters as it burned. Letters that were not Low Gothic and not binaric, and not any language a sane throat should attempt. Lysa slapped the globe off the pipe with a hissed oath. It shattered without sound, and the dark folded close around them again, friendlier somehow for its honesty. "Do we go back?" Ral asked, knowing the answer. Lysa shook her head, a movement he sensed more than saw. The engine seer made a difficult noise that could have been pain or laughter. "Back is where the world is," he said. "And the world is wrong." He crouched and traced a sigil in the dust with a finger, a gear crossed with a skull, plain and permitted. The dust shivered, then erased itself, and Ral spat before he could stop the old superstition. The spit hissed as if it had touched hot iron. Lysa squeezed his hand again, and for a second the squeeze steadied him more than any prayer. A thrumming started, faint at first, coming not from behind, not from ahead, but from the stone itself, a pulse too slow to be anything living, too measured to be anything natural. The engine seer flinched as if struck. "Reactor bleed," he muttered. "Except that is not the reactor's signature." Ral did not ask what a reactor's signature should be. He let the words sit like stakes driven into mud, thin but real, marking a path he could pretend to walk. They reached a junction where the pipes widened into a chamber, filthy with condensate and streaked with minerals like the ribs of some vast dead thing made of salt. In the center stood a console with handwheels arranged in a circle. Ral had seen a sketch of such a system once on a poster that warned workers to respect pressures. The engine seer approached with reverence and caution, bent low, touched nothing. Lysa drifted to the far wall, where graffiti cut into the limescale with a battered tool had left shallow grooves. She brushed slime away and read what someone had carved, her voice flat with the mercy of keeping fear out of syllables. "It says we went down to dodge the tithe and found the choir." Something clinked. "Not far, not near." "Not right." Ral lifted his head and listened. The sound came again, a metal-on-metal tap, as if a drip had learned to carry a hammer and was practicing a new trade. Lysa drew closer without being told. The engine seer hovered over the wheel circle like a priest over relics, indecisive, unwilling to turn what might invite worse. The tapping resolved itself into a pattern, a measure that was almost the cadence of the hum from the manufactoria above, except that where the hum had demanded, this pattern asked. Ral swallowed. The taste of iron returned. He realized his mouth had been open, as if waiting to receive a morsel. He closed it. The pipe sighed. Lysa sucked a breath between her teeth. Somewhere in the walls, something knocked a reply neither of them wanted. The engine seer whispered, not to them, not to the Omnissiah, perhaps not even to himself. "If I turn these in the right order, I can shut off a section of the grid. Starve the wrongness, starve it." He did not say what it was. He moved his hands an inch above the metal, not touching, composing a prayer he had no authority to speak. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed the last tap was so complete it made a sound of its own, a pressure that nested in the ear and warned that even breath might be a trespass. Ral found himself counting in his head. The old habit from line 37, when the counter chrono jammed and the count steadied him until he noticed it had started to keep time with something that was not his will. He forced the numbers to misstep, jabbing them out of rhythm the way he had forced his lungs off the march upstairs. The nausea returned, thinner this time, like a thread through the gut. Lysa leaned close, her whisper a skin warmth against his cheek. If it wanted us to go back, it would have brought the noise with it. He tried to answer and discovered speech had turned into a climb. He reached for it, failed, and nodded instead. The engine seer lifted one hand, then another, arranging the air over the wheel circle as if placing instruments for a delicate operation. Sparks jittered under the skin of his augmetics, faint and wrong-colored, as if his flesh held onto a sunrise that had never existed. "Pressure in 6, he said. "Counter pressure in 9, bleed through 4. If I sequence them as a triad, the backflow will starve this chamber without starving the grid above." He paused, and the pit of his vox grill clicked once, a dry swallow. "Or it will make a vacuum that pulls us through the pipes like a prayer through a bad throat." He did not smile. He did not need to. The choices had made themselves clear. Lysa stepped to the circle without asking permission. She flattened her palms on 2 of the handwheels, felt the metals cold. and then lifted them again as if the iron had tried to kiss her prince. "Tell me which to turn," she said. The engine seer laced his fingers behind his back to stop them shaking, and spoke with the clipped grammar of a litany recited under watch. "On my third cant 6 a quarter, 9 a hair less than that, 4 until you hear the sigh." He angled his head. "Do not overshoot the sigh. It will lie to you." Ral stared at the wheels, at the grime that had built along their spokes, at the thin flares of oxide where sweat had seeded dawns of rust, and realized he could not remember a day he had not turned something for someone else. That thought, small as a splinter, worked under the nail of his mind and ached. He took the third wheel. The engine seer intoned the counts. 1, 2. He skipped 3 and spoke 4 first, as if to break whatever pattern had been listening. Lysa's wheel moved with a rasp that set Ral's molars chiming. Ral turned his slower, until a breath passed through the pipes like a sleeper choosing not to wake. The third wheel offered nothing. He tilted it until the metal told a different story beneath his palms. A slight easing, a not quite give, and the chamber answered with the softest release. As if it had unclenched a fist it had forgotten it was making. For a heartbeat the air cooled. The iron taste thinned. Somewhere in the maze a valve thunked shut with a workmanlike finality that made Ral's shoulders drop. The engine seer sagged and was instantly furious at himself for it. "Again," he said, and his voice steadied. "We will starve what can be starved." Lysa rolled her neck, the tendons creaking, and reached for the next pair. Ral took the one beside it. They moved as if the circle had taught them when they were children, and they were only now remembering the lesson. The second sequence fought them. The wheel under Ral's hand stiffened, then loosened in jerks that tried to pull his wrists into a pattern he did not know. He resisted until resistance became argument, until argument became a standoff with an object that had no reason to care, and yet somehow did. Lysa grunted, a short sound that leaked effort and refused fear. The engine seer traced air signs over the circle, gear, skull, the old numerals of the forge, his fingers refusing to ground on the metal because every instinct spat that to touch now would be to sign a contract. "Steady," he said, "steady. The sigh lies here." He jerked his head at nothing. There. The valve did not sigh, it sang. A single narrow note, too clean, too yearning, that cut across the chamber and made the condensate quiver in thin strings. Ral's wheel spun half a turn of its own accord and then locked, hard enough to bruise. Lysa's wheel stuttered, then settled at a notch that had not existed before. The note faded as if embarrassed by its own nakedness. The ambient pressure dropped, not a lurch but a careful subtraction, and the wrongness that had pooled beneath their thoughts retreated a hand's breadth. Sulking, Ral realized he could breathe all the way to the bottom of his lungs without the inhalation catching on something unseen. He took a longer breath to prove it. The air tasted like old pipe and honest labor. He almost laughed and stopped himself because the laugh would have been a flag. And flags drew fire. They should have moved on then, down the tunnel that bent left into a deeper dark, toward the rumor of clean stone and the promise that distance could outpace intent. But something worked in the wall beside the console. At first he took the sound for drip again. Then he saw it, a seam in the scale, hair-thin, writing itself along the lime like a cut done by an invisible blade. It mapped a circle, then another inside it, then spokes, then an eye that was not an eye exactly, because eyes do not imply teeth. The engine seer's breath clicked. "Back," he said low. "Do not touch. Do not look. Looking makes it faster." Lisa's hand found Ral's wrist and tugged. He did not move. The lines being scratched into the stone had the patience of a clerk at a desk and the certainty of a tide. He could feel the pattern trying to decide what to be. A ward, a welcome, a mouth. The engine seer stepped between them and the forming sign, body angled as if to shield them from a view no flesh wanted. He kept his eyes on the floor and began to speak what sounded like nonsense, until the nonsense resolved into a child's rhyme that had somehow survived in the forges, half prayer, half mnemonic. The pattern slowed. Not much. Enough to prove that the world still remembered cause and effect in thin places. They backed along the pipe-walled throat of the tunnel, one step and then the next, careful not to put their shoulders to anything that might decide to be soft. The pressure continued to ease in tiny increments with each step, suggesting the valves had done more than comfort their own air. Behind them, something breathed out. Not a rush, not a roar, but the exhale of a singer who has finished a note and is pleased with the audience. The engineer flinched but did not break his rhyme. Lisa's fingers dug into Ral's skin harder. He did not ask her to let go. The tunnel narrowed. The ceiling brushed Ral's cap. He took it off and tucked it into his belt and discovered that the personal felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. Ahead, a pallid glow smeared itself along the curve, as if whatever lit the next space had been dampened by decency. They reached the bend and halted, not by choice but because stopping felt like the last human act available. The engineer's rhyme ran out. He breathed once and reloaded with a binaric burst that made every tooth ring. "On 3, he said. 1, the light pulsed in answer. It was not lumen. It was not fire. It had the quality of a memory someone else had loaned them without explanation. The chamber it limned was circular, low and wrong in proportion. The sort of room no approved architect would make because it admitted the possibility of circles that never close. In the center stood a dais constructed from bolted plates, scavenged from places Ral did not want to imagine. And on the dais, an apparatus of rods and mirrors arranged as if to catch a sun from underground. It hummed at the frequency of a surgeon's calm. Above it hung a sphere of liquid that did not fall. Lisa choked. The engineer did not. He spoke through his grill in a voice that had found steadiness on the other side of fear. "This is a focus," he said. "Someone made this. Not demons, hands." He gestured at the mirrors without looking at them. They bent echoes into a point. He did not say what echoes. He did not have to. Ral felt his marrow lean toward the sphere, and knew it wanted to be closer with an honesty that made him step back. On the far side of the chamber, another door waited, stamped with hazard runes that had been scratched over and replaced with crude sigils in soot. Beneath the soot, a hand had written a sentence in a scrabble of chalk. Lisa edged sideways until she could read it. It says, "We turned it and it answered us with sweetness." Her voice made the word taste like a knife that had been licked clean. The engineer's hands rose of their own accord, trembled, and came down hard against his sides. "No," he said to himself. To them, to the room. Ral only then understood how close the man had come to reaching for the levers on the dais, not to destroy it, but to see. He moved between the engineer and the machine without thinking, and found that he was shaking too. Something ticked behind them. Then again. Their familiar cadence. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of the chain above the commissar's cap, the beat the hall had taught them, come here as if it had been quietly following their footprints all along. The sphere quivered, a drop about to fall. The tap came a third time, longer now, as though the unseen hand enjoyed stretching suspense into ritual. The sound found the rhythm of Ral's pulse and seated itself there, turning his heartbeat into accompaniment. He pressed his fist against his chest as if force could silence it, but the beat only grew louder until it filled the chamber like a hidden drum. Lisa stepped closer to the sphere. Her breath fogged in the air, and the fog drifted toward the suspended liquid as though drawn. Ral caught her arm sharply, dragging her back, but for an instant, he swore he saw her reflection inside it, clearer than any mirror, her face lit from beneath by something that was not light. The reflection smiled, though she did not. The engineer began to recite liturgies, words rattled off like bolts from a gun. His voice cracked through a dozen canticles, each sharper than the last until at last he faltered, throat raw, static coughing from his vox grill. The machine before them did not falter. It hummed on, patient, waiting, inviting. The mirrors adjusted themselves by fractions, turning like flowers following a sun, each movement quiet but purposeful, each realignment focusing the sphere. And the sphere began to ripple. Ral thought of water, of the cisterns in the sump fields where he had once played as a boy, but no water in the Imperium ever rippled like this. Each wave in the liquid revealed something beneath its surface. Silhouettes, shadows, outlines of things not bound to flesh. A claw brushing from the inside. A mouth opening into void. A crown that bent and swayed as though grown from living flame. He staggered backward, his boot striking the edge of the chamber wall with a clang that made the sphere shiver. The tap returned, louder. A cadence steady now, no longer teasing. Tap, 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 answered this time by a deeper knock from within the stone itself, as if the planet's heart had joined in the rhythm. The engineer spun, mechadendrites whipping. "It's not resonance," he hissed. Its reply. His voice held the edge of hysteria, the recognition of a man who had seen machine code his entire life and now heard it spoken by something that should not speak. The mirrors shifted further, aligning into a single point, and for the briefest moment, the sphere fractured. It did not burst, did not fall, but cracked like glass under strain. From within seeped a voice, not loud, not soft, but exact, as though it had been waiting for millennia to find a throat to speak through. "Hungry," it said. Just the one word, but it reverberated inside each of them, filling marrow, pressing against thought. Lisa screamed and clutched her head. Ral grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, but her eyes rolled as though her soul had turned inward. He shouted her name and she came back with a gasp, her breath ragged. "It wants me," she whispered. The honesty of it chilled him more than the voice itself. The engine sayer's decision came like the crack of a whip. He lunged forward, his hand closing over one of the levers on the dais. "If it was built by hands, it can be broken by hands," he roared and slammed it down. The chamber screamed. The sphere twisted in on itself, imploding in silence before erupting outward, spraying droplets that evaporated into steam before touching the ground. The mirrors shattered, fragments spinning mid-air like knives, embedding themselves into pipes, walls, even flesh. One shard grazed Ral's cheek, leaving a wound that hissed as if cauterized by thought itself. The hum that had haunted the manufactorum faltered. For the first time since it began, it stopped. The silence that replaced it was not relief. It was expectation, heavy and coiled, as if the entire world had taken a breath and was holding it. The engine seer staggered back, his hand blackened, augmetics fused and sparking. He looked at Ral, at Lisa, and rasped, "We bought time." That's all. Ral wanted to believe him. He wanted to think the act had severed the thread, that they had escaped. But then the tapping returned, faint but undeniable, this time not from above or behind, but ahead, beyond the soot-scarred door at the chamber's far end. It knocked 3 times and then stopped, waiting. Lisa's voice was hoarse. "If we don't follow it, it will come to us." Ral stared at the door, the runes scratched over, the chalk words beneath. "We turned it, and it answered us with sweetness." He clenched his fists until his nails drew blood, and still he did not move. The engine seer looked at the door with the gaze of a man who had already crossed too many thresholds. His ruined hand twitched once, as though rehearsing the gesture of opening. "Down is always safer than up," he muttered, echoing Lisa's words. "But sometimes, down is where the singing begins." The air shifted, warmer now, the silence stretching into a question none of them wanted to answer. Behind them, the sphere's remnants smoked. Ahead, the door waited. And all around, the world leaned further toward the thing that had already chosen it. The manufactorum was not a place of labor anymore. It had become a mouth, and they were already inside. The door ahead loomed like a held breath. Its edges glowed faintly, not with heat, but with the residue of something unseen pressing against it. The soot-scrawled runes flickered, almost as if some hand behind the metal were rewriting them from the other side. Ral found himself stepping forward despite every nerve begging him to run, his boots scraping softly on stone slick with condensation. He hated the sound. It was too loud in a place that listened. Lisa clutched his sleeve again, grounding him with that simple pressure. And when he looked at her, her lips were pale, bitten until blood welled, but her eyes were steady. There was terror there, yes, but also something else. Defiance, fragile but burning. The same fire he had seen when she once argued with an overseer who had tried to dock her rations. That same spark flickered now, facing something far worse than a whip. The engine seer limped toward the door, his ruined hand cradled close, his mechadendrites twitching like wounded serpents. He whispered fragments of binaric under his breath, soothing himself, maybe soothing the machine. He reached the lock plate, paused and tilted his head as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. "It knows we're here," he rasped. His tone wasn't fearful but resigned, the way a man might remark on rain beginning to fall. The tapping returned. 3 measured beats followed by silence. Then 3 more. A code perhaps, or an invitation. Ral shuddered. He had lived his entire life among the clamor of machines, among hammers and chains, sirens and drills, but this was worse than noise. It was patience. Something waiting on the other side of that door had time, and worse, certainty. The engine seer pressed his uninjured hand against the lock. Sparks flared, crawling up his arm, But he didn't cry out. He muttered a litany, a parody of devotion to the Omnissiah, each word clipped, defiled by static as if another voice spoke alongside his own. The lock hissed. The door groaned as its seals withdrew. And then slowly it opened. The air that escaped was cold, but not the honest chill of stone. It was the cold of absence, of a place where warmth had been devoured. Ral's breath fogged instantly, and the taste on his tongue was like ash. They stepped inside. The chamber beyond was vast, far larger than anything should have been beneath a manufactorum. Its ceiling arched so high it vanished into shadow, its walls lined with pipes that pulsed faintly, as though carrying blood instead of steam. And at the center stood a machine unlike any Ral had ever seen. It was colossal, its shape half recognizable, half monstrous. Wheels turned without touch, gears meshed in impossible sequences, and rods drove themselves against nothing. At intervals, light flared within it, not lumen light, but a sickly radiance that painted the walls in writhing colors. Around the base of the machine, figures knelt. Dozens of them, clad in torn work clothes, some still wearing the half-masks of laborers, others with the insignia of overseers. Their bodies were rigid, their heads tilted back, their mouths open in silent song. The hum they had heard above wasn't gone after all. It had been here all along, carried upward, disguised in machinery. The figures swayed in unison, lips moving though no sound left their throats. Their eyes glowed faintly, like coals glimpsed beneath ash. Lysa's hand trembled on Ral's sleeve. "They're still alive," she whispered, though there was no pity in her tone, only horror. "Aren't they?" The engineer staggered forward, transfixed. His gaze locked on the machine, on the movements of its parts, on the impossible logic of its design. "This is not the Omnissiah's work," he murmured, voice breaking. "But it knows us. It has learned the shape of our devotion." His ruined hand twitched, as though yearning to reach out to join those already kneeling. Ral grabbed his shoulder. "Don't," he hissed. But even as he said it, he felt the pull himself. The machine radiated a strange gravity, not physical but spiritual, tugging at every doubt, every wound, every exhaustion carved into his soul by years of toil. It promised something. An end, perhaps. A release. Or a belonging deeper than any creed the priests had ever offered. The tapping resumed. Louder now. No longer a patient summons, but a beat that echoed through the chamber, rattling the pipes, shaking the kneeling figures. And this time the kneeling figures answered. Their mouths widened, their throats convulsed, and at last sound poured out. A chant, low and guttural, yet eerily harmonious, like the grinding of great stones underwater. The words were not Gothic, not binaric, but something older, something that burned to hear. Ral clamped his hands over his ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside him, vibrating his ribs, threatening to unravel his thoughts. He shouted Lisa's name, saw her clutching her head, her lips forming prayers she didn't believe. The engineer had fallen to his knees, shaking, his mechadendrites twitching in ecstasy or agony. The machine's light flared. The chanting rose. And in that impossible radiance, Ral saw movement within the machine's heart, shapes pressing forward, straining against the veil. Claws, wings, faces, not yet whole, not yet free, but closer. So much closer. The manufactorum had become a cradle, and something was about to be born. Before we descend fully into this abyss, allow me one small request. If you find yourself gripped by this descent, if the imagery, the dread, the sense of inevitability resonates with you, then lend this chronicle strength. Share it with those who, like you, are drawn to the darkness of the 41st millennium. Subscribe, so that our exploration of these hidden truths does not fade like the last prayer of a guardsman, forgotten in the dark. In the Imperium, no one survives alone, nor should you wander these stories in solitude. Tear through the hollow of the chamber. Though no storm raged beyond those walls, it was not sound that bruised the ear. It was meaning forced into flesh, syllables heavy as anvils, each one shaping thought and marrow alike. Ral staggered under its weight, his knees threatening to buckle. He had heard battle hymns bellowed in the streets during conscription rallies, sermons shouted until spittle flew from a confessor's mouth, the ceaseless drone of machine prayers echoing down the manufactorum halls. None of those had ever felt like this. This was not a voice heard. It was a command obeyed. The machine at the center shuddered, its vast gears spinning faster, the impossible mechanisms meshing with a rhythm that echoed the chant. Light erupted from its seams, not steady but pulsing, each flare illuminating the kneeling throng. Their faces were slack with rapture, their eyes wide and blazing with colors Ral could not name. Some had no eyes anymore, just sockets glowing like furnace mouths. Their mouths moved in perfect synchronicity, though no two produced the same shape of word. It was not speech. It was invocation. Lisa dropped to her knees beside him, not in surrender but from the sheer force pressing down on her body. She clawed at the floor, nails cracking on the metal. "It's pulling at me," she gasped. "Like it knows every sin I've ever buried." Her voice broke. "It knows what I'd trade for freedom." Ral grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him, though her pupils were swallowed in darkness. "Don't listen," he snarled, but his own ears filled with whispers, his mother's voice telling him he was never meant for the lines, his overseer promising him promotion, a chorus of voices promising release from hunger, from toil, from insignificance. His gut turned with the sweetness of it, the temptation to bow, to give in, to let go. For an instant, the idea of surrender seemed merciful. The engine seer had collapsed fully, bowing before the machine as if before a shrine. His mechadendrites whipped violently, striking the floor in spasms of devotion. "It is the Omnissiah!" he screamed through his vox grill, static warping the words into a machine's howl. "It speaks because we made it ready. Her sings because we have tuned the world itself to its key." His ruined hand pressed against the floor, burning through skin as though to etch the machine's song into his very flesh. Ral lunged, seizing the engine seer's shoulder, but the man thrashed with unnatural strength, his augmetics flailing like serpents. One struck Ral across the chest, throwing him back. He hit the ground, breath tearing from his lungs, stars bursting behind his eyes. Above him the chanting rose, the machine's glow bursting into blinding radiance. And then the veil thinned, the air rippled, not with heat, but with absence, the kind of absence that devours presence. Shadows warped along the walls, bending toward the machine's heart, and within that light, shapes began to press forward, faces that flickered like masks, shifting with every glance, a claw edged with fire, wings that folded and unfolded, but each feather was an eye. The chamber screamed with birth, with hunger, with arrival. Ral staggered to his feet, dragging Lisa with him. Her face was wet with tears she didn't remember shedding, her lips raw from whispering prayers too quickly to be words. "We have to go," she croaked. Ral nodded, though the idea of leaving felt futile, absurd. Where could they run? The world itself was leaning into this moment, pulling them with it. Still, survival has a stubborn instinct, even in the shadow of doom. He half-dragged, half-carried Lisa toward the chamber's far side, where a maintenance tunnel gaped like a wound in the wall. Behind them, the machine screamed louder, the kneeling figures rising now, their bodies jerking as if pulled on strings. Their eyes burned brighter, their jaws distending. One broke from the circle, lurching toward Ral and Lisa with hands outstretched, fingers bent backward at impossible angles. Ral swung blindly with a loose pipe he had torn from the wall, the blow crunching into the figure's skull. Hurt fell, but instead of collapsing, its head split open like fruit, spilling not blood but a swarm of black motes that hissed in the air before scattering into the light of the machine. The sight made his stomach heave. The engine seer had not moved. He knelt before the dais, hands raised, tears streaking his soot-smeared cheeks. His voice had joined the chant, perfect and whole. For a heartbeat, Ral almost envied him. He looked free, exalted. But the envy turned to rage, and rage gave him strength enough to run. He tore Lisa into the tunnel, the hum swallowing them as they fled into the dark. Behind them, the machine roared, a newborn's cry mixed with a demon's laughter. The world shuddered as though in answer, pipes rattling, stone cracking, air thrumming with the promise of invasion. And for the first time, Ral understood. The manufactorum had never been a fortress. It was an altar. In the end, the evacuation siren that stuttered on was just a horn, and the hands that pushed us toward the corridor were just hands. We went because the mouth of the hive had closed for a time, not because the ocean beyond had lost its taste for shore. As we passed beneath the ruined mezzanine, Lisa touched the confessor's sleeve and nodded toward the emptiness where the plate had been. He understood and did not turn his head. Some absences do not need witnesses. Behind us, the vault held its breath. Ahead, The corridor smelled like cold metal, and the exhaust of flyers that had not yet chosen whether to be salvation or sentence. We walked with the others because walking is the prophecy. Stubbornness writes when it cannot bear to speak aloud. The corridor narrowed until our shoulders brushed the walls and the shuffle of boots became the only sane rhythm left. Men spoke in gestures because the air had filled itself with the aftertaste of song, and words seemed like bait. At switchback landings, servitors trundled past hauling stretchers with the tireless patience of machines that had never learned pity, their augmetic hands steady even as human fingers shook around them. A child in a soot-blackened blanket stared wide-eyed from a trooper's back and mouthed soundless syllables, jaw working as if trying to remember the shape of a lullaby. Lisa touched the child's shoulder as we passed, and the small mouth closed as if the contact had negotiated a truce with silence. Tier 18 opened like a gill, breathing us onto a platform where the Hive's armor was thin, and the night beyond moved with shapes we could not claim. Gunships hovered in turns, noses down, exhaust washing grit in tides. The smell here was different. Promethium exhales, ozone, metal hot from friction rather than prayer. A Vox tower blinked a string of identifiers, the way a drowning man blinks for help. I tasted the air like a coward at a new door and felt nothing but cold. It was almost luxury. The Scion commander conferred with a figure in a long coat whose face never showed. Hood up, rebreather dull, rosette stamped on a slate at his hip that might have been decoration or permission. He did not speak loudly enough for us to hear. He did not need to. The way the deck crew glanced and then looked away told its own story. Orders went out in touches and hand sign, and our line kinked untied, reformed toward the gunships, as if a current had changed and we chose to call it command. The confessor stood at the threshold to the embark ramp. Akala chain wrapped so tight around his knuckles, I thought the links would snap. He had given so much of himself to anger that what remained looked almost gentle. He touched brow and breast and shoulder of each person who passed, the quietest benediction I have ever seen. When I came up, he hesitated and studied my face as if he'd mislaid a name there. "I will hear stories about tonight," he said, as if telling me I had left a tool behind on a bench. "If they make you kinder, keep them. If they make you cruel, throw them away." His fingers brushed my temple, light as ash. Lisa received no words. His hand lingered on her shoulder because sometimes that is liturgy enough. The Engineer Prime was not with us. I did not ask where he had gone. The last I had seen, he was crouched over a service panel that spat sparks in patterns that tried to be invitations. His ruined faceplate reflecting a man who looked proud to have found a machine that could still say no. The sergeant caught me looking back down the corridor and shook his head once, slow. "We spend the living," he said softly, not unkind. "We remember the receipt." The gunship's interior was all angles and harness and the polite stink of oil. We strapped in under the watch of a crewman, whose eye implants clicked with small decisions. Lisa squeezed my fingers once, hard enough to make the bones bark. Across from us, the child leaned into the trooper's chest and slept the sleep that exhaustion dictates even to the terrified. The ramp came up. The world fell away. The Hive's skin rolled beneath us in plates and scars and the weird tenderness of a thing that had been hurt so long it had forgotten anything else. We rose into a sky that was not sky anymore, but a roof daubed with wounds. Far away, where orbit tucked itself into the dark, a bruise of color showed where something had pressed too long against the membrane of the world and left its shape. The Vox crackled with clipped markers, waypoints, kill zones, no-fly curtains stitched across the night by men who rebuilt maps faster than fear could move. The pilot's hands were calm on their sticks. The gunner's head turned with the patience of a hunter who knows that game sometimes hunts. Back between the drone of engines came a sound I could not place for a moment because it belonged to a memory I had not owned, the measured murmur of an astropathic choir, faint as breath under snow. It was not in our ears. It was inside the metal of the craft, inside teeth and augmetics and bones. A crewman heard it too. He flinched, and then pretended he had only adjusted his harness. The robed figure in the long coat tilted his head the way a predator does when it is not yet sure whether what it hears is prey or weather. No one named the sound. Naming gives things shape. Shape gives them rights. The gunship banked over an orbital spire that rose like a thorn from the Hive's back. The windows there were dark in disciplined rows, but at the crown, where astropaths once sat inside a cage of gold tracery and whispered across the void. One aperture glowed with the grey of dawn that had no business here. We did not slow. We did not speak. The child woke and watched it pass with the indifferent curiosity of someone whose world has always held impossibility. Lisa's breath hitched. My own did not. I had no breath to spare. We sat down on a pad chalked with warning runes and clotted with evac crates. The ramp hissed open, and we spilled into a wind that tasted of smoke from a dozen fires and the salt of a sea that did not exist. People were everywhere and nowhere, lines forming where no lines had been ordered, clusters dissolving where authority had not assigned them purpose. Somewhere close, a vox blast recited casualty brackets in a voice that sounded embarrassed by arithmetic. A medic shouted for a cooler, as if ice could be summoned by conviction. A guardsman knelt on concrete and retched quietly with his helmet still on, either too proud or too trained to remove it for sickness. A woman in a flight jacket pressed a chit into my palm without looking, a tiny square stamped with a sigil I did not recognize. Identification, ration allotment, a permission to live one more day. The plastic was warm from her skin and from the heat of the printer, and for a moment that warmth made the hole in the world feel smaller. Lisa tucked the chit into my sleeve because my fingers would not obey. Her eyes had a steadiness I had come to respect, like a well-made tool. No ornament, no lie, only function. The robed figure moved away with a small escort, cutting through the coil of evac, with the casual entitlement of someone whose duty is allowed to be a path. As he passed, the wind lifted his hem and showed boots that had not seen dirt today. A soldier whispered inquisition into his sleeve and then apologized to no one for having said it aloud. Rumor swelled and shrank around the coat like breath, shrinking to a tight kernel of fear as he turned toward a stair that led down into the spire's throat, instead of up to the pad. Down, not up, into the choir, not away. Lisa watched him go and did not ask a question that would have had no worthy answer. Night crawled. Dawn failed to arrive on schedule. Somewhere, another section of Hive learned to sing. Somewhere else, a section learned to refuse. Transports lifted and landed with a rhythm that wanted to call itself hope and settled for logistics. The sergeant found us and handed me a canteen that tasted like regret and copper. "You'll ship to the outer tiers," he said. "Hold there. They'll want bodies that still know which way a line faces when it hears a hymn." He paused and scrubbed a hand across his jaw, as if he could sand off sorrow. "If anyone asks whether we broke the world or saved it tonight, you tell them. The vents worked, and the rest is a matter for men who count stars instead of rations." Lisa laughed once, soundless, the shape of a laugh without the air to push it. She slipped her hand into mine. Above us, the bruise in the sky shifted. Bruises do, changing color as pressure argued with time. The Vox Tower blinked again, obedient and small. The child slept sitting up against a crate with a ration bar clenched in a fist gone slack. The confessor sat cross-legged on the concrete with his aquila on his knees and watched people as if their breathing were a psalm he alone had been permitted to hear. I closed my eyes and saw cables, a plate, a woman standing in a fire that wrote her like scripture. I opened them and saw Lisa. Between those sights stretched the distance between rumor and liturgy, and I could not tell which had teeth enough to bite. Engines spooled. A crewman waved us to the next transport with a motion that owned no promises. We went because going forward still looked more honest than staying. As the ramp climbed and the hull shuddered with ascent, I felt the thin thread of a sound tug once more at the edges of thought, a choir behind the sky or the sea under a world, or blood learning a new beat. If it was mercy, it hid its cost well. If it was hunger, it had patience. Somewhere above the smog, above the hive, beyond orbit where the Astronomicon threads the dark like a needle through cloth, something bright and very far away continued, to burn with the same indifference and the same fidelity it has always shown. Perhaps it had noticed us, perhaps not. The choice it made, if it made one, would not be spoken to mouths like ours. The transport turned its nose into the night. The bruise in the sky drifted. The Vox chattered in a language of bearings and fuel and time. Lisa's hand stayed in mine. I counted to a number I had never been allowed to reach on line 37 and stopped because the count felt less like a tally and more like a prayer. I was not sure I wanted answered. The world had quieted a little. It had not repented. It never does. It waits and it learns, and it sings when we are tired. We had bought silence the way you buy bread. Enough for today. Tomorrow would widen. The night above the hive lay black as an unlit candle, and for the first time since the manufactorum howled awake, silence threatened to pass for peace. The transports carried us higher, away from the ribs of the hive, through layers of smoke and ash that clung to the world like the memory of fever. I watched the pall lift in folds, each darker than the last, until the stars broke through in pale clusters. They should have been a comfort, those steady lights strewn like grains across eternity. But I had lived too long in the song's shadow to believe in their indifference. Each star looked now like an eye, staring back, patient, curious, waiting for us to tire. The Vox rasped with clipped orders, routes marked and rerouted, as if the hive itself still shifted beneath us. Below, the spires receded into jagged black, their crowns glowing faint where shrines had burned, their flanks lit by pockets of fire where the swarm had left its signature. I thought of those still inside, the men on the barricades, the children left in hab corridors, the engineer who had sworn to coax obedience from a machine until it broke him. Every loss sat like a stone in my gut, heavier because we were not free of the song, only farther from its mouth. Lysa sat across from me, her head against the bulkhead, eyes closed but body taut. Even in exhaustion, she seemed braced for some unseen impact. A ration chit protruded from her cuff, half crushed where her grip had clenched in sleep. She had not let it go. I envied her for that, the refusal to release the small real things while larger truths gnawed at us unseen. At the gunship's prow, the sergeant leaned on his weapon like a crutch, gaze fixed not on us, but on the void beyond. His lips moved soundlessly, not in prayer, but in repetition. Counting, perhaps, or reciting the names of his squad. The ones he had sent ahead, the ones he had spent behind. Rumor had followed us onto the transport. Of course it had. Soldiers muttered that the choir had spread to other tiers, that it had reached the spires, that it had bent astropaths into instruments. One claimed he had heard a whisper on the Vox, a counterpoint folded beneath the command traffic, too brief to transcribe but unmistakable. He said it had spoken his name. Another swore he had glimpsed a custodian on the ridge, golden and still as a statue, watching as the hive sang. He said the figure had turned away. The confessor, slumped in his harness, spoke softly into the tide of rumor without lifting his head. If the Emperor watches, he said, he watches to measure our weight against the song's hunger. Do not ask what he will do with that measure. Simply be heavy enough. His words did not still the rumors. They only taught them new shapes. We docked at an orbital bastion cut into the hive's outer skin, a fortress of ferrocrete and steel, where soldiers herded evacuees with gestures sharper than blades. Vox sirens wailed, then cut, then flared again in a language more urgent than structured. We disembarked into a hall that smelled of oil, blood, and desperation. The floor was slick with the grime of too many boots, and the walls were scrawled, with chalk marks of casualty brackets, already smudged by hands that had tallied too quickly to stay neat. I followed Lysa into the press. She looked around once, taking in the wounded, the mothers clutching empty ration tins, the soldiers with eyes so wide they looked painted on. Her jaw set. "This is what's left," she murmured. "Not the fight. They're waiting." And she was right. The air was thick with waiting, the kind of wait that smothers more thoroughly than fire. But waiting did not last. From the high galleries, new voices rose. Not human this time, not demonic either, but mechanical. The cadence of servitors reading liturgies from data slates, their tones flat and endless. The words were administratum, tally and decree, population counts, ration allotments, assignment schedules. They read as if nothing had changed, as if the world were not already being eaten alive. Men and women in the hall listened with faces blank, as though the lie was safer than truth. It was then that the first cracks showed. Not in the bastion's walls, they held thick and uncompromising, but in the air itself. A vibration pulsed, faint, almost too small to notice. My teeth tingled. The walls shuddered. The song, dulled but not extinguished, had followed us even here. The confessor raised his aquila and pressed it to his brow, lips trembling. The sergeant snapped orders for the barricades to double their watch. Aunt Lisa, eyes wide and dark, looked at me with the steadiness of a woman who had already asked herself the question I had been trying not to think. What if it never stops? The bastion's galleries emptied themselves of echoes and filled with orders. Not the kind that save a world. Those are myths told over cups, but the kind that stack bodies into patterns that keep panic from breaking bones. A line formed against one wall, where a munitorum clerk stamped chits with a machine that coughed each time it tried to remember authority. The stamp left the imperial aquila crisp in ink, and then in half the cases blurred, as if the paper weakened under the emblem's weight. People still took the chits reverently. The habit of obedience survives where prayer fails. The song threaded the concrete with a patience that had learned our rhythms. It did not blare, it tested. A tremor under the skin, a hitch in the breath, a sweetness at the back of the tongue where hunger turns honest. A woman in line began to hum without knowing. The man behind her slapped his own mouth shut in horror, as if his lips were conspirators. A trooper vomited neatly into a can, and then saluted the mess because discipline is a religion. You can practice even when the gods won't answer. The confessor moved from cluster to cluster with the smallness that makes a thing hard to hate, placing two fingers on brows and saying nothing. Words can be a fuse. Silence can be a tourniquet. A siren rattled the rafters. Vox sputter resolved into a voice with gravel where softness once lived. Tear spine compromised at levels 22 through 30, it said, the cadence of a man who has practiced not faltering. Conflux nodes reporting unauthorized resonance. Repeat nodes singing. Purge teams route to Manufactorum Theta and Shrine Precinct 9. Civilians to pads 4, 5, and 8. Do not heed unverified litanies. The last sentence earned a laugh from no one. He might as well have told the sea not to heed the moon. We were shoved toward pad 5 with the others, a current of warm bodies and colder eyes. Lisa kept one palm pressed to my shoulder blade, so we could not be parted without meaning. A child clung to her jacket hem and would not be convinced he did not belong to us. She let him cling. The sergeant reappeared, thinner with each sighting, like a candle that refuses to admit its height is loss. Transport to the outer rings, he said. Fort system at the cable farms. It's ugly work, but ugly work still pays the tithe of tomorrow. He leaned closer, speaking low so rumor could not draft his words into service. If the song takes root out there, it will starve the hive of food and light together. You want a definition of damnation that isn't poetry? That's it. He straightened. You can say no. He lied with the kindness of it. Lisa's chin lifted. We'll go. Pad 5 gaped open to a night that had returned to pretending it was only weather. The bruise in the sky had thinned to a faint ache. The transports crouched like beetles, engines ticking, armored hides scored with fresh scripture of shrapnel and soot. As we queued, a shape ghosted across the pad's far edge. One of the silent ones, the nulls, moving with that deliberate poverty of motion that denies the world a foothold. Even at a distance, his presence thinned the air until the pad's floodlights looked embarrassed to be seen. Men made the sign of the aquila with hands they hoped would not shake. The null never looked up. He followed a robed figure toward a stair that descended into the bastion's lungs. Down again, always down, where the choir nested or the throat widened or whatever metaphor the mind dared, so it would not have to say the word warp. We boarded. The troop bay was darker than the last, its ribs lined with crates of filters and ration bricks and canisters, stamped with hazard runes that made my teeth itch. The pilot's voice reached us through the hull, the tone of someone who had stapled certainty to the inside of his skull. Cable farms are cold, he said. We land quick. We unload quicker. If you hear anything not in your ears, bite your tongue until it bleeds. Pain knows which world is real. No one laughed. The advice was sound and old and bloody as a butcher's apron. We lifted and skimmed the hive's skin, the spires craning past us like broken fingers. Between them, fire pits showed where purge teams had cut singing sections from the city, the way a surgeon cuts rot from meat. Here a manufactorum stack vomited smoke clean of color. Victory in its ugliness. There a cathedral glowed with an inside-out dawn that meant the Precinct 9 call had been too late. The Vox croaked with two voices at once, a command channel, and beneath it, the faintest murmur of a different choir. The pilot swore softly, and tuned the dials with the care a man reserves for his child's fever. Beyond the sprawl, fields stretched, a latticework of pylons and cable pillars that ran to the horizon, each crowned with transformers that fed the hive like veins feed a heart. The gunship dipped low over a patch where the fields had gone wrong. Cables bowed as if something heavy had sat on them, and then stood. Transformers ticked in syncopation instead of sequence. Out at the perimeter, small fires walked, not burning anything, just rehearsing. "There," Lisa breathed, voice barely a thought, exhaled. I followed her gaze and found motion within the wires, figures climbing the pylons with the intimacy of lovers. Faces turned up to the humming crowns, arms spread as if measuring their reach. From far above, their mouths opened. The sound did not come to us through air. The pylons carried it, a bone tuning the whole field learned in a heartbeat. We sat down in a skirl of grit. The air here wore frost the way a blade wears an honest edge. It bit the lungs clean of smoke and replaced it with metal. A fort cadre met us at a run, Skitari with lenses where doubt should be, line guards with knuckles raw where discipline had chewed them, a handful of agri-serfs who had nailed rags over their ears and carried thresh hooks like relics. Their overseer wore a cog-tooth torque and a bandage where an augmetic ear had been torn free. "Nodes 2 through 7 are compromised," she said, and her voice was a map. "They hum. The hum teaches. A wee cut too." It grew back. She lifted her chin toward the nearest pylon, where cables shuddered in a rhythm that had nothing to do with weather. "If they teach the whole grid, the hive learns to sing through its food." The sergeant set his jaw and did arithmetic with his eyes. Men, guns, angles, time. The scions who had accompanied us moved to anchor the perimeter, their visors scanning, their pattern of motion reminding the field that geometry still had a say. The overseer pointed to a squat building sunk into the ground like a bunker, ashamed of being seen. "Substation spine. We break the sequence there or it breaks us." She hesitated. "There's a Mechanicus tech adept inside, who swears he can write a counter hymn into the modulator. He also swears the modulator has started to answer questions he hasn't asked." She handed the sergeant a ring of keys. They were warm. We ran between pylons whose cables moaned like thick ice shifting on a bitter sea. Lisa kept her hand on my sleeve and her eyes high, watching for the climbers. "I scanned the ground because things that sing above you need worshippers at their feet." We found them at the bunker's lip. 5 figures on their knees, foreheads pressed to the concrete, hands splayed as if waiting for a benediction from below. Their backs rose and fell in a 3-beat breath I knew from the manufactorum's worst nights. The sergeant gestured. 2 guardsmen stepped forward with the mercy of speed. It was ugly. It was necessary. We walked over the bodies because there was no ground left that was not a grave. Inside, the substation breathed hot. Banks of converters thrummed in lines, each crowned with coils that spit tiny sparks like gnats. A tech adept hunched at a terminal, cables threaded into his spine, data needles puncturing the meat of his neck. His lips moved in binaric syllables that wandered in and out of sense. When he saw us, tears carved clean tracks down soot. "They try to teach me the beautiful version," he said, and giggled like a scholar child who has sinned only in thought. "I am rewriting it ugly." He wiped his nose with the back of his metal hand and bared his teeth. "Ugly holds." The sergeant nodded in a way that meant keep talking, keep living. The tech jabbed at a schematic strewn with sigils that had not existed this morning. "The field learned a chord from somewhere it shouldn't. It is teaching the grid to breathe it. If I can stagger the frequencies, make the pylons fight each other, I can starve the resonance long enough for you to cut the climbers down." He glanced at Lisa and me, and for a moment the war went still. "You have the look of people who know how to mistrust rhythm," he said. "Good, hate the beat. Cut off time." The bunker shuddered, a transformer outside barking like an angered beast. The hum surged, pressing against the skull from the inside. Somewhere above, the climbers screamed without sound, bodies tightening in ecstasy or pain. Impossible to tell at this distance. Lisa swallowed, jaw hard, and touched the edge of the console as if staking a claim. "Write it ugly," she told the tech, and her mouth made the order into a promise. The confessor, who had followed us like a shadow that had chosen where to fall, placed his aquila on the console's lip and bowed his head. "Let stubbornness count for prayer," he murmured. The tech adept's fingers flew. The converter's light staggered. misstepping on purpose, turning the smooth hum into a stutter that bruised thought. Outside, the pylon's voices broke, faltered, cracked like adolescence denied its ceremony. The sergeant jerked his chin. The guardsmen burst from the bunker, flamer squads peeling off to burn the climbers loose. Their bodies fell smoking, limbs still reaching for the wires that had promised them a place in the world's throat. The scions put hard light into anything that tried to teach again. The overseer laughed once, a sound like rust giving up and becoming iron. For a minute that stretched thin, the field argued with itself instead of with us. The techs counter him held. The hum tasted of pennies and spite. We cut in ugly time, and ugly time worked. Then the lights on the far bank flared in a pattern I did not want to admit I recognized. The grid had learned our ugly. It fed it back sweeter. The pylons found a new key. The tech's breath hitched. "They listen," he whispered. "So of course they do." His hands resumed their frantic dance, rewriting, refusing, bleeding through his nose and smiling anyway because the refusal let him be a man again. Lysa leaned into me, not for comfort, but to make sure we would tip in the same direction when the ground chose to move. I licked the blood from the inside of my cheek and told my heart to miscount. Outside, at the perimeter, the climbers began to sing with their mouths at last. Their mouths opened not like worshippers, but like hinges creaking, each note prying wider the space between their ribs. The song poured out ragged at first, nothing like the cathedral hymns of the Hive, nothing like the perfect resonance that had stalked us through manufactoria and shrine. This was raw, closer, sung through teeth that had once bitten bread and drunk water. It was the human voice pressed against a wall too high to climb. And yet through the pylons, it carried with strength enough to shake frost from the cables. The guardsmen fired into the lines, flame and shot tearing bodies free from their perches, but every voice silenced seemed to feed the next. A woman's scream above us broke into harmonics that split into 2, then 4, until the sound from her throat carried like a choir trained in agony. The pylons shimmered as if heat lived in their metal, and I realized with a sick jolt that the grid was not only carrying their voices, it was learning them. The lattice was becoming an instrument, every fallen singer another note the metal remembered. The tech adept convulsed against the console, sparks leaping from the data needles in his neck. His voice cracked in binaric, syllables lurching into nonsense, then steadied. "They teach faster than I corrupt," he hissed, blood painting his teeth. "If I stall too long, the Hive will sing itself apart." His mechadendrites whipped against the floor, scrabbling for purchase like dying serpents. The sergeant barked a wordless order, and flamer squads surged forward again, hosing the pylons in sheets of promethium. Fire crawled the steel, blackening cables, peeling shrieks from the mouths above. The stink of burning flesh joined ozone until the air was thick enough to chew. Still the song clung, still the grid hummed with a new melody that refused to die. Lisa grabbed my hand, her nails cutting crescents into my skin. "It won't stop," she said, not in despair but in furious recognition. "Every time we cut, it remembers. We're teaching it that we bleed in rhythm." Her eyes locked on mine, sharp, alive, unwilling to yield. "We have to break it all. Not just the voices, the lattice." The tech turned his head, jerky and stiff, as though the wires puppeted his neck. "She's right," he spat, his laugh a wet gurgle. "A full purge. Collapse the farm. Feed the Hive darkness before it learns to feed itself." His fingers scrabbled across the panel, calling up schematics of the cable farms that stretched for leagues. A forest of pylons and wires lit up in red on the slate, a circulatory system feeding not just power, but now a song into the Hive's bones. "Destroy it," he whispered. "Destroy me if you must, or else you'll never outrun their verse." Outside, a new chord swelled, richer, crueler, as if the field itself had grown lungs. The pylons thrummed not in stutter, but in harmony, and the climbers' voices were no longer ragged. They were beautiful now, devastatingly so, a music that made knees weaken with longing even as stomachs turned with dread. The soldiers faltered, some lowering their weapons, one dropping his flamer to clutch his head, sobbing. The confessor staggered forward, Aquila raised, shouting words I could not hear over the hymn. And for the first time I felt it again, the temptation. The song was not just in the air, nor the pylons, nor the men who had given their throats to it. It was inside my blood, tugging at a part of me that wanted release from hunger, from fear, from counting bolts on a line until death found me. It whispered that there was another life, not as slave or soldier but as voice, pure eternal, woven into something that did not die. Lisa saw my hands tremble and spat into my face, the salt sting shocking me back. "Stay with me," she snarled. "You'll not waste your lungs for them." She jammed her pistol into my palm, empty though it was, a weight to anchor me. "Fight, Ugly. Offbeat. Don't let them make you music." The tech screamed, slamming his fists against the console. The lights on the schematics pulsed faster, pylons glowing red one by one. "I can overcharge the grid," he choked out. "Burn every node, collapse the lattice into silence. But it will cook everything here, me, you, the farms, the food lines." His eyes rolled, caught between terror and rapture. "It is the only way to unteach them." The sergeant didn't hesitate. He ripped his vox bead from his collar, roared coordinates into the channel. Somewhere above, the heavens answered with a thunder that did not belong to gods, but to the orbiting batteries of the Astra Militarum. A strike inbound, brutal and uncompromising, the kind of mercy measured in megatons. Lisa's grip tightened on my hand. Her eyes shone with the fire outside, with the promise of annihilation, with a defiance that looked like prayer. "Then we die ugly," she whispered. "Better that than singing." The grid screamed. The sky cracked, and the world braced to choose whether silence or song would inherit it. The first impact came as a light too bright to be seen, a pressure that folded the lungs before the ears caught the thunder. The ground leapt, cables whipping like snakes severed mid-strike, pylons snapping at their roots and toppling in arcs that crushed the bodies still clinging. Fire rose not from flamer or promethium, but from the very air, a column that tore itself upward as if trying to reach the bruise in the sky and smear it clean. The hymn fractured, breaking into jagged screams, the pylon's harmony shrieking like metal, forced through a throat it had never owned. We threw ourselves against the bunker's floor as shrapnel screamed through the substation. The tech adept convulsed once, wires sparking from his spine, and then slumped forward onto the console, his data needles sparking themselves into smoke. For a heartbeat, I thought the song had died with him. Silence settled like dust, heavy, merciful. But then came the echo. Not from mouths this time. Not even from the lattice. From the hive itself. The strike had burned the field clean, yet the grid's memory ran deep. Buried in ferrocrete, threaded through habtiers woven in the ribs of manufactoria, the hum lingered like breath held too long. It rose again, weaker, fractured but present, as if the hive had taken one lesson from its tormentors. Survival was repetition. The sergeant dragged himself upright, blood on his temple, weapons still steady. He looked at the burning horizon, where pylons fell like matchsticks and nodded once, grim as a priest admitting heresy and finding no punishment left to give. "It will hold," he said, though we all knew hold meant hours, not generations. Lisa spat black grit and tightened her grip on my arm. "Hours are enough," she muttered. "Hours buy ships. Hours buy silence. Hours buy a tomorrow." Above us the sky churned, the bruise spreading then thinning as if ashamed of its own wound. Vox chatter spilled across channels, reports of collapse, of sectors drowned in fire, of others briefly clear. Somewhere voices whispered about reinforcements, about the Emperor's light burning brighter for a moment as the song faltered. Others muttered that the silence was only the breath before a new verse. The confessor gathered the scorched aquila from the floor, his fingers blistered but steady. He lifted it high, not in triumph but in defiance. His voice cracked as he spoke, not a sermon, not even a prayer, just words dragged from a throat that had not yet given itself away. "We are not theirs." The survivors around him repeated it, ragged, broken, ugly. It was no hymn. It was better. We staggered from the bunker as the fires ate the horizon. The climbers were ash, the pylons bent bones. The farms that had once fed the hive lay ruined, blackened veins across a corpse that still twitched. The sergeant called in coordinates for evacuation, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed the arithmetic of starvation he had just condemned his people to. Lisa leaned her head against mine, exhaustion trembling in her bones. "We bought silence," she whispered. "That's all we ever do." I wanted to tell her silence was enough. That ugly, fragile, temporary silence was victory. But the truth sat heavier. The hive was already learning again. Somewhere in some forgotten tier, another note was waiting, a throat ready to open. As transports descended in streaks of light, carrying soldiers and survivors from a world both purged and poisoned. I looked back at the cable farms one last time. The fire there bent strangely, twisting in eddies as though invisible mouths still sang, shaping flame into verse. I blinked and it was gone. Or perhaps it had only been the wind. We boarded, engines spooling, the horizon receding in smoke. Above, the Astronomicon burned, distant and indifferent, its beam threading the void as it always had. Whether it had noticed the song that had dared to rise beneath it, I could not say. Perhaps it never would. Perhaps it already had, and its silence was its answer. The gunship rose, carrying us into a night that felt thin and unfinished. Behind us, a world whispered in ugly silence. Ahead of us, the void listened, patient. Somewhere, the choir behind the sky waited for the next breath, and I understood with the clarity of pain what awaits a world devoured by demonic corruption is not only ruin. It is the echo, the hunger that remembers, the silence that never holds forever. It is the knowledge that the next song has already begun, too quiet for us to hear yet. The tunnel did not so much end as change its mind, narrowing to a crawl space before yawning into a service artery lit by dying lumens that clicked like insects. We ran until running turned into a negotiation with our lungs, each breath a bribe paid in pain. When we finally stopped, it was because the floor sloped up and the stink of the sump gave way to a smell I had not realized I missed until that moment. Old oil and warm dust. The honest perfume of a hive that still pretends to work. Lysa leaned against the wall and laughed once, a broken sound that tried to be courage and almost made it. I rested my forehead against cold steel and wished the metal would bless me back. The world above spoke in distant groans. Not explosions. Not yet a bending, a settling. As if the hive itself were a ship in high seas and the waves were made of pressure and prayer. I had always thought of the hive as immovable, a mountain built by hands that would never see the sky. Now it felt like bone, living, aching, trying to heal wrong. Lysa wiped her mouth with the heel of her hand and left a smear of blood she did not notice. He stayed, she said. There was no need to name him. The engine seer's face rose in my mind with the clarity of a cut. The way he had looked freed and ruined at once. I could not forgive him for wanting what the machine offered. I could not forgive myself for understanding. We followed the service artery until it met a maintenance stair that had been designed for men shorter than honesty and twice as tired. We climbed. At the first landing, a door hung crooked on a single hinge. Low Gothic had been stenciled there once. Authorized personnel only, then crossed out and replaced in a scrawl of chalk with a single word: hunger. I did not tell Lysa what it said. She read it anyway and spat dryly, an old underhive habit against bad luck. The spit sizzled where it landed, and we pretended not to see. At the second landing, we found a body. I knew him by the boots first, Arbeitsissue, black and cruel. The rest of him was less official. His visor lay cracked beside him, and his face had the washed-out look of a man who had died staring at a very bright light for too long. His shock maul still hummed. I took it because a weight in the hand is braver than a prayer in the mouth. Lysa slid his pistol from the holster, checked the charge by touch and grimaced at the gauge. 2 shots, she said. I'll make them both lie. She held the pistol like a promise. We pushed through the door and into a corridor that belonged to the mid-hive, where the pipes went quiet enough to hear your own thoughts, but never quiet enough to hear them well. The walls wore the graffiti of 1,000 small defiants. Names, hearts, crude aquilae, curses against overseers, blessings for children that had probably died anyway. The corridor's lumens flickered an even rhythm that meant they had not yet been taught the new song. I took comfort in that the way a drowning man takes comfort in a plank. We kept to the edges, boots soft on grating, and came upon a junction where the corridor opened into a hab ward. Doors lined both sides like teeth, most sealed, some ajar. From one, a radio played a hymn at the wrong speed. Voices stretched until they became the sound of metal being pulled thin. From another, steam seeped under the threshold, sweet as a boiler room. Lysa reached for that door and drew her hand back as if burned. Don't, she whispered. It smells like the soup my mother made the winter. The tithe took all the good meat. I smelled nothing but sugar and iron, and that was enough to agree. We found people. Not many. The mid-hive is never empty, not even when it pretends. A woman sat on the floor with her back against a vending alcove, cradling a bundle that did not move. singing into it in a voice a shade too bright for morning. When she lifted her head at our footfalls, her eyes were filmed with something that looked like frost. "The Emperor sends bread," she said, and lifted the bundle to show me a blank swaddling cloth. Her smile was very gentle. I nodded because sometimes a nod is the only kindness left. Lysa touched the woman's shoulder and left a ration bar beside her knee. We walked on before the woman could ask the bar to sing. At the hab ward's far end, 3 men had barricaded a door with furniture. They watched us over the backs of chairs, with the look of men who have taught their hands to move before their minds can change them. One had a lascutter. One had a length of pipe. One had nothing but a stare. "We're not here to take your spot," I said, and lifted the Arbeitsmaul in my hand so they could see it plain. They did not relax. The one with the pipe flicked his eyes toward the ceiling. "They talk in the vents," he said, and I realized he had not asked my name because names are for days when there is time. They ask questions like a preacher. They know answers you never said out loud. Lysa glanced at the grills high along the wall and backed a step unconsciously, as if sound could lean out and touch her. The man with the lascutter swallowed. "You seen the guard?" he asked. There was hope there, poor and threadbare. I did not want to rip it. I looked at the floor. "I saw soldiers," I said. "They fired until the world answered back." He nodded as if that counted. Perhaps it did. He offered us water. We refused because courtesy can be fatal, and because the bottle's surface crawled with condensation that wrote and unwrote the same word in loops I could not read. He took the bottle back and did not drink either. Some fears teach quickly. We left them with the furniture and the vents and moved toward the transit shaft that would take us up to the market tiers. The shaft's doors stood open, teeth bared, the platform somewhere far above, the cable thrumming. Lysa peered into the depth until vertigo licked her and then pulled back. "We climb?" she asked. "We die," I said. The stairs wound around the shaft in tight switchbacks, the kind of architecture that decides for you whether you will live through a sprint. We took them anyway because forward is a direction with fewer arguments than back. On the 7th switchback, we met the smell of smoke. Not the holy resin of the ecclesiarchy, not the smoke of Prometheum when a flamer kisses oily rags, but the thin, cruel smoke of hab plastic and flesh. The market level had begun to burn. We moved faster. The maul grew heavier, not by weight but by implication. The way a word becomes heavier, the more you are forced to repeat it. On the 9th switchback, a figure barreled down toward us, feet slipping on the metal steps, hands blood-slick. He wore a butcher's apron and a priest's eyes. "Back," he panted. "They're cutting sense out of people like rot. The preacher says the throat is a gate." He tried to shoulder past. Lysa caught his sleeve. "Whose preacher?" she asked. He jerked his head upward. "Not ours." He tore loose and fled down, and I did not blame him. We reached the market. Once this had been a place of noise and color. Stalls hawking contraband flavor packets, bins of spare parts, cages of sump eels, the drone of cheap voxcasters blaring catechisms to drown the swindle. Now the color had narrowed to shades of flame. Stalls burned with a disciplined eagerness that suggested hands had arranged kindling and offered blessings to fire. Between the blazes, people moved like sleepwalkers, faces blank with the intensity of a single thought. A confessor stood atop an overturned crate, his voice raw, denouncing devils with a fervor that tasted like envy. He gestured with a censer that swung empty, smoke provided now by the world itself. In the square's center, a knot of Astra Militarum huddled behind improvised cover, crates and stall tables, a wall of scavenged shutters. Their sergeant had the unshaved jaw and careful eyes of a man who measures rations down to breaths. He saw us in a single glance, judged us not dangerous enough to shoot and not safe enough to invite. "Civilian," he called to me, and the word felt like both accusation and elegy. "You armed?" I lifted the maul. He nodded. "Then you're press-ganged," he said with the flat humor of a man who knows his own joke is a tax. Lysa lifted the pistol without comment. The sergeant gestured with 2 fingers. "Keep low. If the shrine starts singing, you stuff wax in your ears and run. We fight what bleeds. We don't argue with air." His squad looked nothing like the parade posters. One had a bandage wrapped around a stump, where his left hand should have been. One had eyes that kept tick-flicking toward a broken Vox unit, as if waiting for it to forgive him. One held a flamer, and stroked its tank like a pet that might bite. The commissar was absent. Either he had died doing his job, or he had decided the job was not to die here. I did not ask which. I took a place along the shutter wall. Lisa slid in beside me. The sergeant glanced upward, where the hive's ceiling vanished into smog cut by girders. "They're gathering," he said. "You feel that?" I did. Pressure. A distinctness in the air like the moment before a rivet gun fires. A scream slit the square. Not terror, invitation. Heads turned that should have kept still. From the far arcade, a line of bodies came walking. Men, women, children. They did not march. They tracked forward, as if their feet remembered a route they had never taken, bodies swaying with a rhythm that did not belong to their muscles. Their mouths were open, and something like steam left them with each breath, condensing in the air into thin strings that quivered and twanged, and then vanished. The sergeant hissed between his teeth. "On my mark," he said, and the squad lifted weapons like a single machine. "We aim for joints," he added softly, as if apologizing to a butcher. I told myself I would swing first, that I would be a part of the world that chose to resist. But the line of walkers drew closer, and I saw a face I knew, an overseer from line 37, the one who had docked my pay for slowing to wipe blood from a gear. His cheek had been cut into a shape that made my gorge rise, and in his eyes there was relief. Relief to have finally surrendered to something larger than his miserable authority. My hands loosened on the maul. Lisa's knuckles whitened around the pistol. "2 shots," she said again. A reminder to herself and to me that limits, spoken aloud, can hold back floods. The sergeant gave the mark. We fired. And the mark, it screamed in a new voice. The volley cracked through the square, las fire snapping like whipcord, the flamer exhaling its liquid hymn across the advancing line. Flesh charred, bones blackened, and yet the figures did not scatter. They kept walking step after step, mouths spilling that thin, shimmering vapor that hung in the air like threads of a web. When the first of them fell, it did not fall as a body should. It folded, like a puppet set aside, limbs clattering loose before the torso crumpled into a smear that bled more light than blood. The sight made the guardsman beside me curse and fire again, until his pack hissed empty. Raoul, the name felt distant even when I thought it, swung the maul. The charge bit through one of the walkers, its body spasming before splitting in a crackle of ozone. The smell was obscene, burnt hair and sweetness combined, a perfume that pressed at memory and threatened to become pleasant if I let it. I gagged and swung again, not for victory but for the assurance of motion, for the reminder that my arms were still my own. Beside me, Lisa fired her pistol, one round then the other, each shot carving ruin through the chest of a figure whose smile never faltered. She let the empty weapon hang after that, fingers trembling. "No more," she said, and her voice was less despair than grim arithmetic. The guardsmen held the line, their formation ragged but stubborn. The sergeant shouted orders, but his words were already thinning, his voice drowned by the answering cries of the things they fought. For as they burned and bled, the walkers began to change. Their bodies slackened, bones sliding like wax softened over fire. Limbs elongated, joints reversed, mouths unhinged. What had been human became parody, and parody became weapon. From the wounds we dealt them, more vapor hissed out, weaving into the air, thickening into strands that coiled toward the burning shrines around the square. And the shrines. The shrines began to answer. At first it was just a flicker of light, candles guttering in ways flame does not. Then came the sound, low and droning. The hymn twisted, stretched, reshaped into something that vibrated in the teeth. The shrines sang, their icons bending in shadow, the faces of saints twisting into grimaces of delight. The sergeant's head snapped up. "Ears," he bellowed, but too late. One guardsman dropped his rifle and screamed, clutching his skull until blood poured from his nose. Another tore the aquila from his breastplate and drove it into his own throat, gurgling as he smiled. Lisa jammed her fingers into her ears, and I followed, though it muted nothing. The song was in the marrow, in the air, in the space between thoughts. The shrine's stone cracked, and from the fissures seeped a glow that pulsed in rhythm with the song, each beat stronger, louder, hungrier. The sergeant fired his sidearm into the nearest shrine, the bolt detonating the altar in a shower of stone and fire. For a heartbeat the song stuttered, then it rose again, louder, deeper, as though mocking him. "Fall back!" he roared, voice ragged, pointing toward the far arcade. His men scrambled, dragging the wounded, stumbling over ashen corpses. Lysa seized my arm. "We can't stay here." Her face was pale, her lips cracked, her eyes wide with the reflection of too much fire. I nodded, but my feet felt rooted, drawn toward the shrines, toward the sound. Each note whispered promises. No hunger, no pain, no work, only song, only belonging. My grip on the maul loosened. It clattered to the ground. Her slap cracked through the haze. "Ral!" she shouted, voice raw, dragging me back. The sound of my name, the human truth of it, cut deeper than the song. I staggered, shook my head and grabbed her hand. Together we ran, stumbling through smoke, past soldiers firing wild into shadows that no longer held shape. Behind us, the market burned not with fire but with color, a brilliance that no human spectrum should contain. We burst into a side passage, choking on the smoke, the echoes of the song still gnawing at our bones. Somewhere behind, the sergeant still shouted, his words fading beneath the roar of shrines breaking, saints falling, stone itself singing. The sound chased us into the dark, a reminder that no wall, no door, no distance could keep it from following, and still we ran, because running was all that was left. We ran until our legs threatened to betray us, until the smoke thinned into corridors where the air carried the sour tang of rust and mold instead of fire. The market's screams had dulled to a muffled chorus, distant but still threaded with that song, like a memory that refuses to die. Every lumen flickered on the edge of failing, shadows swelling and collapsing in sync with some pulse that was not the power grid. When we finally slowed, hunched against a wall streaked with old graffiti, Lysa's shoulders shook as she gulped down air. She did not weep. There were no tears left for that, but her body trembled as if it had only now remembered fear. My throat ached from smoke, and every breath burned. The Arbite's maul was still gone, left where my hands had abandoned it under the shrine's call. I hated myself for dropping it, hated the weakness in me that had heard promise in the warp's music. Lysa noticed, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, hoarse but steady, she whispered, "It almost had you." The words cut deeper than the slap. I could not deny them. I wanted to, but the memory of that warmth, that awful invitation to rest, clung like grease to my thoughts. The corridor sloped downward into another hab sector, though this one was quieter. Too quiet. We passed doors pried open and left yawning, apartments stripped not of valuables but of presence. No furniture overturned, no bodies, no struggle. Just emptiness. At one door, a child's toy lay abandoned, a carved wooden aquila, its wings chipped. Lysa stooped, picked it up and turned it over in her hand. The little bird was warm, as though freshly held. She placed it back on the ground with care, whispering a prayer that her voice betrayed. We did not linger. Deeper into the hab sector, we found the first sign of life. A pair of old men hunched beside a broken heat vent, their faces grey with dust. They did not startle at our approach. They barely looked up at all, as if movement cost more than fear. One of them murmured something under his breath, a litany so quiet I could not catch the words. The other simply stared at the wall, eyes glazed, lips cracked. When Lysa crouched to offer a canteen, the first man finally looked at us. His pupils were narrow, pinpricks in a field of yellow. "That won't let us drink," he whispered, voice so thin it might have been smoke. Every time I swallow, I hear it laugh. We left them, not because cruelty was easier, but because there was nothing to be done. Some wounds are deeper than flesh, and water cannot heal them. Past the habs, the corridor opened into a transport hall where mag rails once ran along the hive's spine. The rails were dead, their hums silenced, but the hall was not empty. A company of Astra Militarum had made camp there, their numbers ragged but their discipline intact. Tattered banners still hung over their barricades. An imperial aquila, its wings smoke-stained but defiant, and beneath it the motto of their regiment. I could not read it through the grime, but the men looked at it as though it still meant something. The sergeant who intercepted us was younger than me, his jaw too smooth for the hollows in his eyes. He asked no questions, only took in our soot-streaked faces and nodded once. "Civilians," he said. "Stay low. Don't run. Running draws them." His words were clipped, memorized, as if he had spoken them to 100 souls before us. He led us behind the barricade, where soldiers sat cleaning rifles with shaking hands, or staring at nothing, or rocking gently, as if to lull their own thoughts. From the hall's far end came noise. Not the song this time, but something more primal. Screams, the chitter of steel against stone. Boots thundered as another squad stumbled back through the smoke, dragging a comrade whose torso had been torn open. His insides glistened in the lumen light, steam rising from wounds that did not bleed right. They laid him down, and he gripped the arm of the medic who leaned over him. "Don't let it sing me," he gasped, voice wet. "Don't let it in my mouth." Then his body stiffened, jaw snapping wide. The medic rammed a bayonet through his throat before the chant could begin. No one flinched. No one wept. They had seen it too often. Lisa turned away, hands pressed over her face. I forced myself to watch because if I did not, I would hear it instead. The bayonet slid free with a wet sound, and the medic wiped it clean on his trousers before moving to the next wounded. I stared at the soldier's corpse, at the faint curl of vapor still leaking from his mouth. Even in death it reached for the air. The sergeant returned, his voice steady, though I could see the tremor in his hands. "They'll be here soon," he said. "The song carries them. We hold until the signal flare. Then Emperor willing, evac." He glanced at me and Lisa. "You can fight?" I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him I was just a line worker, that I had never been a soldier. But the memory of the market square, the feel of the maul in my hands, the sight of bodies folding into shapes they should never hold, these silenced me. I nodded once. Lisa lifted her chin. "2 shots left," she said, her voice like iron. The sergeant gave a grim smile. "Then make them count." The barricade shuddered as something struck the far side. Then again. Metal screamed. The soldiers raised their weapons, eyes fixed on the hall's shadows. The hum began to rise once more, faint at first, then stronger, weaving itself into the sound of the approaching horde. The shrines had been only the beginning. Now the hive itself sang, and we braced ourselves, knowing that when the song reached us, there would be no choice but to answer. The barricade shook again, harder this time, as if the hive itself had chosen to strike against those who still clung to its bones. Metal braces groaned, rivets spat sparks, and one of the soldiers muttered a prayer under his breath that ended with his own name, as if reminding the world he was still himself. Then the wall gave way, not all at once, but in bursts, panels buckling, plates ripping outward as claws forced through from the other side. The first of them came crawling. Once human, yes, but reworked, as if the song had reached inside and sculpted them like clay. Their limbs bent where they shouldn't bend, mouths split wide enough to crack jawbones, eyes glowing with the same feverish light that had burned in the kneeling congregation. They dragged themselves over the debris, bodies jerking to the rhythm of the chant, each movement in time with that awful, patient hum. The sergeant fired first. His bolt pistol barked once, twice, each shot tearing a body into ruin that dissolved almost instantly into vapor. But for every one that fell, 2 more pressed forward, scrambling with insect speed, voices spilling sound that was not quite words. "Hold the line!" he bellowed, and Lasfire answered, a storm of crimson streaks cutting into the swarm. The flamer roared, spewing a curtain of burning promethium that turned screams into shrill laughter. I found myself on my feet before my mind caught up, seizing a broken length of pipe sharpened to a crude spear. The heat of the flamer singed my skin as I drove the weapon through one of the crawling things, feeling the shudder as it pierced too many bones. Lisa stood at my side, the pistol raised. She fired once, the recoil snapping her arm, and the round exploded a creature's head into fragments that dissolved before they touched the floor. 1 shot left. She didn't lower the weapon. The creatures surged, hurling themselves at the barricade with no thought of survival. A guardsman screamed as one clamped jaws around his throat, tearing away flesh in a spray that steamed as it hit the ground. Another fell, dragged into the tide, his lasgun vanishing in the churn of limbs. The medic dropped his kit and fired point blank, sobbing as he emptied charge after charge into the mass. Then the song changed. It deepened, stretching into a chord that reverberated through the walls, the floor, the marrow of our bones. The soldiers faltered, weapons drooping, some clutching their helmets as if trying to shut it out. One by one, a few stopped firing altogether, lowering their guns, their faces slack with wonder. They stepped over the barricade and into the tide, greeted with open arms by the horrors waiting there. The creatures did not tear them apart. They embraced them, folded them into the swarm, bodies twisting, reshaping as if welcoming them home. The sergeant roared, voice ragged with fury, and shot 2 of his own men in the back before they could cross. His face was a mask of grief and defiance, eyes wild but unbroken. "We are not theirs," he howled, firing again into the mass. His words struck me harder than the gunfire. We are not theirs. A mantra, an anchor, a tether against the song. I clung to it, repeating it in my head, even as the walls quivered with pressure and the air thickened with vapor. Lysa clutched my arm, her mouth moving soundlessly, lips forming the same words. We are not theirs. We are not theirs. The chant beat against us, but for a moment it did not own us. Then the flare went up, a crack of light tore the smoke above, bursting through the hive ceiling with desperate brilliance. The soldiers cheered, some with voices breaking, some with voices already too thin to carry hope. The sergeant kept firing, but I saw the shift in his stance, relief or maybe resignation. Reinforcements might come or they might not, but the signal had been sent, and for a heartbeat that was enough. The creatures recoiled from the flare, hissing, twisting, their bodies shuddering as the light burned through the gloom. For the first time they hesitated. The song wavered, no longer perfect. The swarm faltered. "Now!" the sergeant roared. "Push them back!" And for the space of a breath, hope returned. The flare carved a wound of light through the hive's throat, and for a heartbeat the swarm recoiled as if burned by memory. It was not salvation. It was a pause, a hitch in the world's breath where choice could still pretend to exist. The sergeant used it like a lever, jamming bodies and crates into the gap until the barricade stopped screaming. He counted men with his eyes and did not move his lips, as if numbers uttered aloud might attract attention from things that loved to change totals. Lysa's hand found my sleeve again, not pleading, not weak, just there, a knot in the rope that tethered me to myself. We looked up through the drifting smoke toward that white seam the flare had opened, and for a foolish moment I imagined the heavens looking back with mercy. Then the light bled away along the girders, swallowed by smog and distance, and hope resumed its proper size. The swarm did not retreat far. It ebbed to the hall's edge and hung there, bodies convulsing, faces half-remembered. The song continued beneath hearing, a pressure between ribs that made breath a negotiation. The sergeant barked orders: redistribute charge packs, check seals, lash the wounded to stretchers so the song could not convince their legs to wander. A Vox operator hunched over his set with a lover's intensity, sweat streaming, whispering into the grill as if asking forgiveness. Each plea came back as static threaded with sighs. He kept pleading anyway. We listened because the rhythm of his voice was human, and sometimes rhythm alone is enough to persuade the heart that a shape may hold. Time, already elastic, stretched thinner. The flare's echo vanished. The rails beyond the barricade vibrated to an approaching pulse, too measured for footsteps, too slow for engines. Lysa closed her eyes and mouthed something that might have been prayer or arithmetic. When she looked at me again, her face had the clean lines people wear when they have decided what they will do if they see a certain thing. I envied her that steadiness even as it terrified me. Resolve is only beautiful before it is spent. The first rumor arrived well ahead of any reinforcements, borne by a pair of stretcher men from another flank, their uniforms scabbed with soot. They slid their burden down, pulled the canvas back for a medic, and then could not stop talking. "Dropships," one panted. "From orbit, markings scrubbed." The other shook his head, pupils blown wide. No astropathic confirmation. They just fell out of the night like teeth. He swallowed. "Some say Astartes. Some say the Inquisition. Some say it's just us over and over again, arriving to save ourselves and failing." The sergeant told them to save their air. The stretcher men nodded and kept talking in whispers because rumor is a kind of morphia men share when proper drugs have run out. Another soldier, older than all of us and wearing his rank like a bruise, muttered that the astropaths in the orbital spires had gone quiet before the first rift ever opened. "Not dead," he said, "worse, singing." He spat the word like gristle. They turned their throats toward the Astronomicon, and the echo pointed down. He did not claim truth. He let the sentence sit like a broken idol no one dared to throw away. The Mechanicus spoke next, because of course they did. The Engineer Prime from this cohort had lost both Auspex arrays and half his faceplate, and still he stood, hands clasped behind his back as if conducting an inspection. "The grid is behaving like a body," he said, and the way he said behaving made it both diagnosis and insult. Pressure valves dilate, Reservoirs constrict, lines psst in peristaltic sequence. His voice caught on the binaric splice where flesh met doctrine. We keep shutting sections. They reopen. Not via command, via intention. It's like a throat clearing. A confessor lurked near the rear line, robes ash-grey, Aquila on a chain bouncing over his chest like a heart that had set itself free. He watched the engine seer with an animal hunger. "Do your machine prayers include the litany against invitation?" he asked too softly. The engine seer inclined his head by a hair. "All litanies are now against invitation." The confessor smiled a tired smile and turned to us, raising his voice by inches. "Listen, all of you. You may hear stories soon, that the Emperor has turned his gaze here, that the Astronomicon flares brighter for our sake, that his hand reaches through the golden throne to pluck us from the jaws of the immaterium." He paused long enough to let our hearts lean toward the fantasy. Then he shook his head. "If you hear it as certainty, it is a lie. If you hear it as hope, keep it quiet and use it like a poultice. That is all hope is for in a siege." Lysa lifted her chin. "Then what do we stand on?" she asked, as if she had cornered a truth and meant to make it pay tithe. The confessor did not flinch. "On each other," he said, "and on the fact that stubbornness can look like faith from a distance." A tremor ran through the hall, not a quake. A shiver, like a horse trying to dislodge flies it cannot see. The swarm hissed as one, then fell quiet, heads tilting. Something listened to our listening. The sergeant gestured his men lower, the way a father might drop his voice on a stairwell so a sleeping child will not wake. The hive answered with a far-off report like a door slammed by weather, then another, closer. A breeze licked our faces, impossible, sweet with ash, and carried with it the noise of engines we had all learned to trust. The thunder of a gunship's approach, assault cannons spooling, grave plates shouldering air aside. Men who had not prayed since conscription did it then without words. The swarm contracted, uncertainty rippling through it like cold across a pond. The gunship's shadow crossed the mouth of the hall. Its presence pressed on lungs a machine's gravity. Over the vox came a fragment of disciplined fury. Orders stitched with coordinates, clipped identifiers, a demand for beacon flares. Our operator sobbed and sent pings with fingers that could not keep still. The gunship skimmed the hive's ribs and vanished into smoke again. The hall exhaled as one animal. Even the confessor looked upward as if permission had been granted. What fell with the next gust was not relief. It was parchment, charred at the edges, raining gently down like tired snow. I caught one sheet without meaning to, and words stared back. Administratum allocation tallies reduced to ash, requisitions for rations written in a neat hand that had believed in afternoons. Between the lines I saw where Heat had printed another text, just for me. A child's bright scrawl, a manufactorum's kill switch, a mirror of liquid pretending not to listen. Lysa plucked a page from the air and folded it once, twice, until it was small enough to hide in her palm. She did not explain. She tucked it into her cuff, as if to carry a memory that was written on someone else's skin, in case the song tried to make us forget ours. Far down the concourse, the dim resolved into figures not shaped by the swarm. They moved with intention, armor heavy and honest, steps like punctuation that corrected a sentence. Not Astartes, no. The silhouette was leaner, the presence narrower. Tempestus science, perhaps, or an elite draw from the Astra Militarum, marked by discipline that had not yet been traded for wonder. Behind them, civils staggered, escorted, shells inside whom small stubborn lights still burned. The sergeant dared a grin that did not touch his eyes. "Someone punched through," he said. He did not say how long that would matter. The scions, if that is what they were, did not pause. They swept the edges with cold light, combed the ceiling with auger beams, planted beacons at measured intervals like nails driven into a trembling wall. Their comms hissed with tight exchanges. When they reached our barricade, the lead trooper's visor shed a line of rain-streaked soot and revealed nothing but his own breath-fogging glass. "Corridor will not hold," a filtered voice declared. "We fall back to the lion's throat. Vent the concourse on my mark. Seal after. Kill what sings." No one argued. Even the confessor simply blessed the order with a nod he tried to keep small. We began to move as a body. The wounded were lashed fast. The dead were kissed with 2 fingers because there was no time for more. Charge packs rode on backs not meant to carry them. The Vox operator humped his set like an altar. The swarm flowed, to match us probing, tasting, never quite committing so long as our pace stayed measured. Something about the cadence of the Scion's steps made the hall rebel less. They walked as if the floor owed them favors. We passed a shrine to the Emperor that had not yet learned to sing, its candles guttered with decent flame. Someone had left a tin cup of water at the base, a childish offering to a father who would not drink. Lysa paused only long enough to set the folded parchment beside it, a paper votive for a god who might prefer stubbornness to gifts. "For the ones we left in the pipes," she murmured. The confessor heard and did not correct her theology. The lion's throat proved a choke point between two cargo vaults where the hive's ribs cinched tight. Ramps canted upward toward blast doors, big enough to bar a god. The Scions deployed with the mathematics of men who knew how to price flesh. The sergeant took their flanks with the weary grace of a man who understands his job is to be counted and then reduced. The engineer prime limped to a console half chewed by heat and began to argue with its spirit in the cracking tongue of Binaric, until the spirit admitted grudgingly that it would obey a little while longer. The plan, like all good plans inside a hive, made itself simple. Vent the concourse to starve the song, fall back as the doors shut in stages, keep the wounded from hearing the choir the void sometimes pretends to be. The confessor went man, woman to woman, whispering a litany that contained, in unadorned words, the instruction to bite down hard if the voice inside your mouth started to sing without you. He handed out short strips of leather. No one laughed. As we took our places, a rumor walked up beside me in the shape of a quartermaster who had once known joy. "The astropathic choir on the spire," he said, as if remarking on weather. "They say it's begun to harmonize with the swarm. They say the Astronomicon is not dimmer here, only farther away, like a beacon through rain." He scratched his jaw and offered me a strip of leather. "They say if the Emperor is watching this, he is watching to see who holds." He shrugged. "Rumors are cheap. Ammunition isn't. Use the one you have." The Scion's gauntlet rose. The engineer whispered a final obscene tenderness to the console. The blast doors breathed. The vents yawned like mouths preparing to sing a counter hymn. Air changed character, took on a lean edge that meant it intended to leave. The swarm stiffened as one organism discovering that its tide has discovered shore. Somewhere behind us, deep in the manufactorum's belly, a machine remembered it had been built by hands and hated the memory. The hall shuddered, as if something enormous had nudged the planet to get its attention. The confessor finished his litany and put a strip of leather between his own teeth. Lisa slid hers into her mouth without looking at me and kept her eyes open. The gauntlet fell. The vents tore open with a howl that belonged less to machinery and more to hunger. The air rushed out in a gale, dragging smoke, ash, and the first rank of the swarm with it. Their mouths stretched wider in silent protest as the pressure ripped them apart, bodies unraveling into threads of light that shredded and vanished into the void. The shrines lining the concourse screamed back, icons bending as if trying to grip the walls, but their voices faltered in the vacuum, cut short like candles snuffed beneath glass. We staggered against the force, clutching at whatever anchor our hands could find. My knuckles burned as they locked on a length of railing, the gale yanking my body sideways until my joints cracked. Lisa's hand slid along my arm, fingernails digging until pain steadied me. Her eyes streamed, not with tears, but with blood from the vessels bursting beneath the pressure. Still she held on. Still she glared at the void like a rival she refused to bow to. The Scions moved as if born for this. Their mag-locked boots clamped them to the deck, their visors shielding eyes that would otherwise have burst. They fired, into the tide even as it peeled away, bolt and plasma tearing the writhing remnants into fragments too small to carry song. Their commander's voice came crisp over Vox, a steel needle in the storm. "Hold line, stage 2 in 20. No tremor, no panic, just inevitability shaped into order. The engineer prime clung to his console, mechadendrites wrapped around it like roots around stone. Sparks spat from the panel, painting his skull in flashes. He whispered not litanies but pleas, coaxing the machine's spirit to endure. I could read the refusal in his posture. The vents wanted to close, to breathe back in, to invite. His body shook with the strain of denial, but he did not let go. Then the song returned. Faint, impossible, but there. Not carried by air now, there was no air, but vibrating through steel, through bone, through thought. The swarm had not ended, it had only changed its tongue. The shrines split open, stone, flaking like bark, and from within seeped light that formed shapes. Not bodies this time, but outlines traced in brilliance, as if memory itself had learned to wear flesh. They pressed against the torrent of vacuum, shuddering but not breaking, their mouths still open in voiceless hymn. The soldiers faltered, firing wilder, desperate. One tore the strip of leather from his teeth and screamed words I could not hear but could see in his throat. His scream turned into song, his body lifting from the deck as if gravity had forgotten him. He struck the ceiling, split apart, and scattered into the light. The sergeant snarled and hurled himself forward, pinning another man who had begun to rise. His bolt pistol spat, mercy and execution in the same breath. He turned to us, face pale but eyes burning, and mouthed the words we had heard before. "We are not theirs." I bit down on the leather until my jaw ached, until blood filled my mouth, until the song dimmed behind pain. Lysa did the same, teeth clamped, her gaze locked on me as if daring me to slip. The shrine's light quivered, their forms unraveling under the assault of the void. For the first time they looked uncertain. "Stage 2, the Scion commander barked. The engine seer slammed his hand against the console, and another row of vents yawned. The gale doubled, tearing shrines from their moorings, ripping them free of bolts and prayers alike. They spun into the void, their voices cut short at last, their light dimming as though ashamed. The swarm convulsed, its remnants flailing, and then it was gone, sucked screaming into nothing, scattered across the stars. Silence followed. Real silence. The kind that tastes clean even in a hive. We collapsed against the barricade, chests heaving, ears ringing. The soldiers lowered their weapons with hands that shook too much to reload. The engine seer slumped, mechadendrites drooping, his chest rattling with static. Lysa spat the strip of leather from her mouth and wiped blood from her chin with the back of her hand. Her smile was thin, bitter, but alive. The Scion commander turned to the sergeant. "This sector is purged. Fall back to Lion's Gate. Reinforcements inbound." His voice carried no triumph, only duty. The sergeant nodded, though his eyes lingered on the bodies of his men, on the smears of blood, on the strips of leather still clamped between teeth that would never sing again. We had survived. But survival in the hive was never victory. It was just the next breath. And even as the vents closed, as air returned in a slow hiss, I felt the walls tremble with something deeper, something that had not yet finished its song. The choir was still out there, and it was learning new verses. We fell back in a staggered procession that wanted to be a parade and could not remember how. The vents sighed shut behind us, the concourse sealing in stages with the mournful dignity of a cathedral, boarding up stained glass before a storm. The air returned in thin threads that tasted of copper and old rain. Each breath felt borrowed. The Scions set the pace with a metronome's cruelty, not from malice but because mercy wastes seconds. At every landing they planted another beacon, each one stuttering a cold, clear pulse that made the shadows think twice before they gathered. The sergeant paced our rear like a shepherd who knows the wolves have learned arithmetic. Rumors walked with us, because rumors always keep up. They slid between ranks and squeezed into the breaths between orders. Someone said a black ship had been seen in high anchor, silent and unlit, her holds yawning like a confession. Someone else swore the Adeptus Custodes had been sighted on a sister world, 3 jumps away. Golden like a cruelty you could love, their footfalls so heavy the ground forgot to tremble. The confessor allowed the words to flap once like loose canvas, then pinned them down. "If you must speak miracles," he said, "speak them softly like secrets told to children so they can sleep." No one argued. We needed sleep, we could survive. Lion's Gate loomed ahead, an aperture vast enough to swallow manufactoria whole. Its teeth of armored shuttering hung half-closed, like a jaw deciding whether mercy or appetite should win. The engine seer prime limped to the gate's altar console and touched it the way a son touches a father he does not forgive. Runes fought to illuminate under his fingers, flaring and failing as if embarrassed by being seen. He hissed to them in binaric, until their shame turned to grudging obedience. They carved a path through the maintenance grid, he told no one and everyone. We will walk where they intended us, and then we will make intention regret us. Beyond the gate stretched a vault where the Hive's bones showed, massive ribs of ferrocrete and rebar, the ceiling far enough overhead to host weather of its own. Light leaked from damaged lumens like blood through gauze. In that cavern, sound did not travel so much as arrive suddenly and all at once. Ahead, somewhere beyond the next bend, a choir rose and fell. Not the manufactorum's hum, not the shrine song, but something older. A long, low chord that made the floor feel like an animal sleeping under our feet. The Scion commander lifted a fist, and our column knelt without being told. The chord rolled on, steady as tide. Lysa leaned close, breath warm despite the chill. "It sounds like oceans," she whispered. "I've never seen one. I had once a hololith in a scholar hall, a blue lie that smelled of dust. This sound smelled of salt and iron filings. We waited for a count that arrived by muscle memory in the commander's wrist, and then we slid forward again. The vault narrowed into a ribbed passage, stitched with service galleries. In one such gallery, a trio of astropaths crouched, blindfolds crusted to sockets that had not bled clean for hours. Their attendants had been neatly executed, each with a bolt hole where faith had kissed the skull. The astropaths' mouths moved in silence, tongues flicking at air as if tasting a language no throat was meant to learn. Lysa started toward them with a reflex that had nothing to do with doctrine. The confessor held her back with a hand that trembled only after it had done its duty. "If they're singing," he said, "they are already beyond our kindness." Lysa nodded and did not forgive him. Neither did I. The chord deepened. Girders creaked in a slow, aching flex, as if the Hive were stretching toward a distant warmth. The Vox operator licked lips that would not moisten and tapped his grill. "Command channel," he rasped. "Whisper traffic. Somebody's saying the Astronomican's pulse is braided." The word felt wrong in his mouth, like a prayer misremembered. The Engineer Prime did not look up from the gate logic. "Braided," he repeated, flat. "Then the beacon is shining true, and interference walks to meet it." He let the sentence die in the air rather than gift it power with conclusion. We reached a mezzanine overlooking the vault's heart. Below us, worship had been arranged, not by priests, by engineers. Whole Hablock shells had been craned into a circle, their innards gutted, their skins bolted together to form a ring of broken homes, now serving as the ribs of an engine. Within that ring, scaffolds supported an armature of mirrors, rods, cables. A brother to the device we had destroyed, grown vast and learned. At its core hung no sphere. It was emptiness shaped like invitation. Around the armature stood a congregation of hundreds, workers in stained coveralls, nobles in singed silks, arbites in cracked carapace, children with eyes like coins sunk to the bottom of a fountain. All swayed to the chord, heads tilted, throats open. And at a dais built from plasteel crates, a woman spoke into a vox horn. She wore no sigil of priest or marshal, only a mechanic's coat cut down and cleaned. Her hair had been shaved except for a single braid that hung like a promise. "Brothers," she called, her voice pure as a bell in a desert. "Sisters, the Emperor is not the only light that orders the void." She smiled as if confiding gossip. "This world has been hungry forever. We have fed it our backs, our blood, our children. Now the world eats for itself. We need only stop denying it." The confessor inhaled, ragged. His lips formed the shape of excommunicate traitoress and found no breath to carry it. The Scion commander's visor angled a fraction, as if to check angles, fields of fire, tolerances for mercy. Beside the woman, a relic lay on the dais, or what pretended to be a relic. A plate of gold, perhaps, warped and pitted. Its edges engraved with a feathered pattern like wings melted in a wind too hot to be air. An icon from a shrine. A parody of one? Lysa's fingers dug crescents into my sleeve. "She found that below," she breathed. "In the pipes. We were tasting its echo long before we knew." Her voice cracked. "We should have broken more." The woman's gaze lifted as if she had been alerted by a voice only she could hear. "To Yassine," she announced, smiling toward the mezzanine with unhurried grace. "It is well. Witness makes everything honest." The congregation turned as one. Their eyes were not aflame. They were damp, human, full of relief, the kind of relief that makes forgiveness feel cheap. The Scion commander raised 2 fingers. The sergeant hardened next to me like a man remembering his father's hand on his shoulder, the day he lied about his age to join. The Engineer Prime angled toward a service panel, that fed a forest of cables into the ring. The confessor drew in a breath heavy enough to anchor a city and spoke not with thunder, but with a voice that had spent all its anger and found iron underneath. "Children," he called, and the word made me want to weep because of how closely it fit the faces below. "There is light only because there is dark to suffer it. You have mistaken the appetite of the ocean for mercy." The woman laughed, delighted. "Old man," she replied, "you have spent your life telling us to die well. I offer them a way to live well, and you shiver." She lifted the plate of gold and held it aloft. It caught no lumen. It swallowed them. For a breath I believed I saw, reflected in its warped face, a star tens of thousands of light years distant, a needle of song that has kept a species from falling. It was not the golden throne. It was not the Astronomicon, but the reflection placed itself nearby, like a rumor showing you a street you think you remember. I blinked and it was only metal. The commander's fingers fell to the hilt at his chest. The sergeant's breath left him once, furious and resigned. The engine seer murmured to cables, as a lover murmurs into hair before the shears. Lysa pressed her forehead to my shoulder for a blink, and then lifted it again, dry-eyed. We had come here to hold a line. We found a choir that thought it was mercy, and above us, beyond hive and sky, beyond orbit and beacon, something old and bright continued to burn through rain. Indifferent to the songs men teach themselves to survive the night. The commander's hand rose and flattened, the kind of calm that makes violence wait its turn. Through the visor his breath fogged, measured and unhurried, the metronome of a man who understands that cadence is a kind of weapon. The congregation watched us with that terrible human relief, still soft in their faces, and some part of me ached at how close it looked to mercy. The woman on the dais, braid neat against her neck, coat scrubbed clean of oil, tilted the warped gold plate to catch nothing and give back less. For an instant, it made the light in the vault feel old, as if we were borrowing radiance from a past that wanted its debt paid in song. Lysa's fingers tightened on my sleeve until bone answered bone. "If they start to sing with us," she whispered, "the line will dissolve." She meant our line, our bodies. We had all seen how quickly a mouth could become a gate. Signals traveled along the mezzanine, the way voltage runs through wire. A scion tapped 2 knuckles against his chest and ghosted left to the service gallery that fed the ring's cable forest. Another unkinked a smoke canister from his belt and held it like a bad idea given good timing. The sergeant, his jaw sandpapered raw by days without rest, leaned toward the confessor, who stood with his Aquila chain wound twice tight around his fist, and neither man pretended they had the right tools for this. The engine seer prime laid one palm on a panel and flinched as if a tongue had licked his hand from the other side. His mechadendrites fanned in a circle, searching for an obedience that did not feel like complicity. The cord under our feet swelled. It rolled through the vault like a tide drawn by a double moon. When it touched the plate, something answered, not louder, simply thinner, like wire pulled until it sings. Heat rose in a breath of cold, the kind of paradox the warp deals in with a lover's confidence. Below, the congregation swayed, and the woman turned her head as if acknowledging an arriving guest. "You feel it?" she said into the voxhorn, her voice threading the ribs of the hive. How the choir behind the sky has always sung above the Emperor's beacon, quiet, steady, patient as a truth we were too afraid to say aloud. She smiled. "The Astronomicon feeds the ships. This feeds us. Rumor belongs to mouths, not to law," the confessor had said. He took one step forward on the rail and raised his hand without flourish, palm open. "Children," he called, and that word was a knife, clean and unadorned. "Not every appetite that spares you asks a price you can live with." The woman laughed, light and intimate, as though they were old friends in a kitchen, and tipped the plate toward him. My stomach lurched. For an instant it did not show his face or mine or any man's. It showed a turnstile of days with no whip, a shift with no hunger, a bed that did not remember tears. I knew the lie by the sweetness of it. The commander's fist flicked down, smoke uncoiled from the mezzanine in disciplined clouds, grey that knew its job. Hot-shot beams cracked, neat and surgical, stitching the armature's upper braces, a support pin sheared with a sound like metal, relieved to admit it had been asked for too much, and a section of mirror rig slumped, throwing the void-borrowed geometry out of alignment. The engineer snarled something obscene and kicked a breaker. The ring stuttered, lights along its struts flickering in patterns that wanted to be words and chose petulance instead. Below, the congregation flinched without knowing why, heads turning not toward us but inward, as if a thought they had not invited had tried to sit down. The woman did not flinch. She raised the plate higher. The cord climbed in sympathy, teeth set in harmony. "Do you hear what you do to yourselves?" she asked us without anger. "You pull shut the throat that would feed you. You choose winter out of habit." She lowered her chin and looked straight at me, as if a dozen lenses and a gulf of smoke and distance were a table between us. "Ral," she said, and the theft of my name punched breath from me. "You have counted parts for years. Let your hands count towards something that sings." Her smile had no malice in it. That was the cruelty. Lisa moved before I did. She vaulted the rail to a maintenance ladder that dropped to the cable forest, her boots hammering rungs that shook the air like a metronome caught stealing. I followed because my body remembered what my resolve kept forgetting. That closeness does not always look like safety, but sometimes it is the only honest choice. We hit the gallery and ran bent through hanging leads that smelled of ozone and spit. The first cable we reached was thicker than my wrist, jacketed in braided steel, warmth throbbing under its skin like blood. I had a cutter on my belt, a cheap tool meant for wire that obeys. This did not. I drove the blade in anyway, teeth gritted, arm trembling. Lisa took the empty pistol from her holster, jammed the barrel under the braid like a pry, and leaned her weight into it, face chalk white and set. "If it screams, don't listen," she panted. "Just cut," it screamed. Not in air, in the bones of my forearms, in the fillings of my teeth, in the soft logic of the part of my mind that catalogues shapes and calls them home. I bit down so hard something cracked in my mouth, and the taste of blood helped. The cutter chewed, skittered, bit, and then found a seam that wanted breaking. We heaved together. The braid gave with a sound like a promise recanted. Sparks sprayed our faces and died with spite. On the dais, the plate faltered, dipping a degree. The cord dipped too, losing a note it had not known it relied on. Below, one child blinked and began to cry without knowing why. Two men put their hands to their throats and looked at each other, as if the air had just told them a secret in a language only bodies learn. "Again!" Lisa gasped, and her mouth was blood and grin. We should have died for the luck of that seam. Instead, we trusted it twice. We threw ourselves at the next cable, found no seam, made one. The woman's voice cut through the smoke, no longer confiding, now edged with a new metal. "You cannot starve a song," she said. "You can only change its key." The plate brightened without light, drawing the room like thirst draws a tongue. The engine seer yelped as a lash of current found him, and bared his teeth with mad pride, because pain had answered him honestly for the first time in days. "Hold," he hissed. "Hold, you miserable, beautiful thing." Above us, the confessor finished a prayer that was half admonition and half apology. He had a squat canister in his hand. Sanctified promethium, the sort the ecclesiarchy pours on altars when holiness requires flame. He kissed the aquila once, and threw the canister underarm with the muscle memory of a man who had spent his youth lifting heavy things for people who did not notice. The lid clanged against the dais and rolled at the woman's feet. The commander's bolt round found it before it could think to be shy. The detonation was not grand, it was intimate. Fire spilled like an argument that will not be postponed, licking the warped plate, the voxhorn, the hems of a coat that had been so carefully cleaned. For a heartbeat, the plate resisted. Then it bent, not from heat but from humiliation, and the cord snapped 2 ribs worth. The congregation shuddered. Some fell, some screamed, some stared at their hands, as if the fingers had just returned from a long trip. Others only swayed harder, and began terribly to sing, their voices thin but determined, as if to cradle the wounded cord with human throats until the machine could learn again. "We are not theirs," the sergeant mouthed, and shot a man who had started for the rail with a smile like a door opening into a room with no floor. We cut the 3rd cable. The gallery lurched as power rerouted, the ring groaning not because we had hurt it, but because it had been given the chance to be honest about pain. The smoke puddled heavy as wool. The woman on the dais stood in the promethium fire and did not burn as flesh burns. She burned like paper that reveals hidden letters as it chars. Her voice dimmed, then flared, then fractured into harmonies that made my skin remember cold oceans I had never seen. "Behind the sky," she said, and it was suddenly a whisper. "The choir has always loved us. The vault changed pitch. From somewhere above, so far past the ribs that the hive might as well have been a lung, there came an answer. Not from the woman, and not from us. Engines, yes, but bigger. Not a gunship's snarl. Something heavier, wider. A beast that made girders bow with courtesy. The Scion commander looked up as if he could see through rock. His visor showed him only his own breath, and perhaps one line of possibility he could not afford to hope for. "Brace," he said, and his calm was a bridge we had to run across before it finished being built under our feet. We cut the fourth cable, and the ring screamed like a church taught to lie. The plate slipped in the woman's hands. She laughed through smoke that clawed at her throat, and for the first time it sounded unsure. The girders around the ring shivered as if remembering wind. The plate in the woman's hands guttered, swallowing light in weak gulps, and Lisa and I soared at the fourth cable with the dull courage of people who have already outlived their luck. Spark spat, bit died. The cord tried to rise and found its throat hooked. Below, the congregation's sway lost its grace. Some stumbled and blinked, as if waking into a room they did not choose. The sergeant's mouth formed the shape of a prayer he refused to voice, and the Scion's muzzles tracked the dais with the patience of men who know the difference between last warnings and first shots. The answer arrived from above as a pressure that made teeth ache. It had the sound of engines, yes, but engines trained never to explain themselves. Dust fell in a fine rain. Lisa's gaze snapped up, and my own followed, though there was nothing to see but rib and smog and black. Then the air changed in a way my skin remembered from old nightmares I had written off as fatigue. Heat bled out of the world, not by degrees, but by admission. The choir did not go silent. It was made smaller by something that refused to be a sound at all. They came down through access ways we had not registered as doors, figures in storm-dark plate with smooth helms and no vox grills. Their steps so quiet the floor remembered them, only after they had passed. No sigils, no catechisms, only a presence that was not presence, an inversion of all the invisible weight we had carried for days. When the first of them crossed the mezzanine, the hair on my forearms fell flat as if ashamed of standing. A soldier beside me gagged without vomiting, eyes watering, palms pressed to his ears though there was nothing to hear but our own blood. "Nulls?" someone breathed, and the word made the vault flinch. They made no address. They had nothing to say that throats could carry. One lifted a hand, fingers splayed, and the air around the dais went thin and hard. The woman's laugh broke midway and fell to the floor like cut ribbon. The plate dimmed to dull metal. The cord collapsed into the whine of a wire under too much load. People nearest the dais clutched their chests as if their hearts had tried to forget the beat they had kept since birth. The confessor sagged to one knee and wept each tear like a confession, not for sin but for relief. The woman clenched her jaw and raised the plate as if weight were a choice. For an instant I admired the stubbornness, because I recognized its bones. Then the first bolt rounds came, flat and disciplined, punching through smoke with the indifferent mercy of physics. The warped metal leapt in her hands and fell, clattering against the dais. Fire took her coat at the hem where promethium still licked the air, and for the span of a breath, the blaze showed letters crawling across her skin, as if the light had tried to write her name and found there were too many meanings. The plate skidded to the edge. Lisa's eyes met mine. We did not speak. We were already moving, bodies making the decision the mind might have argued into failure. We hit the last two cables together, not because we believed cutting them would save the hive, but because the honest act of severing what had fed the song felt like a better use of breath than waiting for grief. The cutter bit and stalled. I set my boot against the brace and leaned until veins rang in my temples. Something in the braid sighed, resigned, and parted in a spray that stung skin and memory. The ring groaned, a long, low animal note, and sagged toward its own truth. Around the dais, men and women fell to their knees not to worship, but because gravity had found them again. The silent figures stepped through the smoke in a fan. Wherever they moved, the invisible itch behind the eyes went out like a guttered wick. The congregation recoiled without knowing why. Some sobbing, some gasping at the taste of absence the way a man might gag the first time he drinks clean water. A boy clapped his hands over his ears and screamed at the quiet because he had been born to noise. The confessor rose, bent, lifted a child who had collapsed, and held him like a slow litany, as if the act of weight could argue a universe back into bargain. On the dais, the woman stood alone in her coat of fire and spoke as if to an intimate who had not arrived. "Behind the sky," she whispered, and her voice had become a thread fraying in cold wind. "They love us." The nearest of the silent ones drew a short blade with a motion that contained neither haste nor contempt. The candlelight of the flames made no shadow on the blade and gave nothing back to the helm that watched her. She did not resist. Perhaps she could not. The blade rose, fell, said what needed saying. She folded like a worker at end shift, gently as if sleep had finally been allowed. The ring slumped further, one spur tearing free and carving a ragged crescent from a habshell's wall. The engine seer prime flung himself away as a rain of bolts and glass descended, his faceplate cracking on the floor with a noise that sounded like a mask telling the truth. The Scion commander pointed, and his men moved to pull bodies clear, working with the matter-of-fact speed of people who know every delay breeds more names for stone. The sergeant gripped my shoulder hard enough to bruise, his mouth shaping words I did not catch. It did not matter. His hand was the message we dragged where we could. We triaged hope the way quartermasters price rations. The congregation was no longer a choir. It was a crowd in a room where a lie had stopped being fluent. Some stared at their empty hands. Some clawed at the air like men trying to catch the fish that had once leapt gladly into their nets. Some looked toward us with hatred, because pain wants a face to assign itself to. When one surged at Lisa with a piece of mirror, she slipped aside by instinct alone, and the Scion nearest us punched the attacker into the floor with the heel of his palm. No shot. It was a kindness measured in anatomy. One of the silent figures stepped near enough that the world around my head went dim and tight. Thought slowed, stripped of glitter and threat both, until what remained was the shape of my breath and the steadiness of Lysa's beside me. I understood with the clarity of a bad dream explained in daylight why the stories about them are never told at full volume. Their nearness is a relief that hurts. The choir behind the sky, if choir it is, had no purchase here. In that blister of blankness, what I believed and what I feared sat down together like old enemies offered bread. The plate lay at the edge of the dais, a dumb, buckled thing. I kicked it without meaning to and flinched as if it might bite. It did not. It skidded, spun, and settled face up. No reflection. Just a warped surface that watched nothing. Lysa knelt, put 2 fingers on its rim and left them there as if checking a pulse. "It's only metal," she said. And I heard the question tucked behind the words, was it ever anything else? The confessor came up beside us and stared down for a long time that moved like a decade. "Relics are what we survive them to be," he said at last, voice cracked raw. "So are lies." The ring let go. It came down in a slow collapse that spread out like a sigh under a closed door. The Scions hauled us backward. The silent ones had already stepped away with the unhurried efficiency of people who do not give collapse permission to be dramatic. The armature canted, tilted, crumpled inward and lay broken, no light left to pretend. The vault breathed again, coarse and ordinary. Somewhere high above, engines banked and rolled. And for a heartbeat, the roof seemed thinner, the sky closer, as if a new decision were making its way down through stone. We stood in the smoke and the raw air and tried not to invent meanings we could not afford. The Vox operator's set crackled with a voice that kept itself small, as if afraid to disturb what had finally gone quiet. "Evac corridor clear to Tier 18, it said. Clipped, urgent, devoid of miracle. Civilians prioritized. Purge elements hold until signal." The commander looked to the silent figures. They nodded once, in motions that seemed to make a cold wind even where there was none, and slipped back into the hive the way knives return to their sheaths. The sergeant tucked 2 fingers under his belt and checked what ammunition he had left, as if counting days. Lysa wiped soot from her mouth with the back of her hand and then stared at the smudge on her skin like an omen she decided not to read. I looked at the plate and thought of the engine seer who had stayed below, of a machine that had learned to sing the shape of our weariness, of a world that had leaned toward appetite long before any door in the air opened. Above us, the engines passed again, heavier than weather, whispering the possibility of a wider mercy or a cleaner cruelty. If the choir behind the sky had been diminished here, I could not tell whether the world had been saved or simply quieted long enough to be measured. The hive still shuddered like an animal coming down from a fever, Somewhere other rings might be learning other songs. Somewhere a man might be saying that the emperor's light had brightened, and somewhere else a woman might be promising that new gods had arrived. Between those rumors we breathed,